Section 1. The ranking system and why this show deserves it. Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull your blanket up a little higher. Let your shoulders drop. You don't have to hold on to anything right now. We're just going to spend a long while together in Springfield, working our way through every major conspiracy this show has ever inspired, ranking each one by how much real, canonical evidence actually backs it up. Not hype, not Reddit upvotes. Actual evidence from the episodes themselves. The Simpsons has been on the air since the 17th of December, 1989. That's 36 seasons. Somewhere around 788 episodes, depending on when you're watching this. It is the longest-running American animated series, the longest-running scripted primetime series, and by almost any measurement you care to apply, the most analyzed piece of television ever made. People have spent their careers picking this show apart. Academics have written dissertations about it. The writers have been asked about fan theories in formal interviews and had to answer carefully because some of those theories are uncomfortably close to what the writers themselves were thinking. And yet, for all of that analysis, there has never been a proper ranking. Not a real one. Not one that sits down with every major theory, weighs the evidence calmly, and places each one in honest relationship to the others. That's what we're doing tonight. The ranking system works like this. There are 6 tiers, and each one represents how well supported a theory is by what the show has actually shown you on screen, what the writers have confirmed in commentary or interviews, and how internally consistent the theory remains when you stress test it against the broader canon. Tier F is at the bottom. These are theories that are fun to think about, that have a certain charm to them, but when you actually look for the evidence, there isn't much there. A few coincidences, some creative interpretation, maybe 1 or 2 scenes that could be read a certain way if you squint. Tier F theories are the ones you find posted at 2 in the morning on a forum thread that has about 40 replies before dying out entirely. Tier D is slightly better. These theories have a genuine observation at their core, something real that the show actually does, but the leap from that observation to the full theory requires more assumption than evidence. There's a there, but it's small. Tier C is the middle ground. These are theories where the evidence is real and meaningful, where multiple episodes support the same reading, where the theory holds together under scrutiny even if it doesn't hold together completely. Tier C theories deserve serious attention, even if they can't cross the finish line. Tier B is where things start to feel genuinely unsettling. These theories have substantial canonical support, multiple episodes, confirmed by patterns that stretch across seasons, backed by things the writers themselves have acknowledged. Tier B theories change the way you watch the show. Tier A is near ironclad. The evidence is overwhelming. The theory explains things that no other explanation handles gracefully, and dismissing it requires you to ignore a significant amount of what the show has deliberately put on screen. And Tier S is reserved for the theories where the show itself has essentially told you the answer. The evidence isn't circumstantial. It's embedded in the structure of the episodes themselves. Tier S theories aren't fan interpretations. They're close readings of something the show has been saying out loud for decades. There is also a Tier S+, which we'll save for the very end, because it's the one that contains all the other theories inside it. We're going to move through these slowly, the way this show deserves. There's no rush. The night is long and Springfield is strange, and there's a lot to talk about. Let the tension in your jaw ease. Let your eyes get a little heavy. You can follow along or just let the words wash over you. Either way, we're going in. Let's start at the bottom. A brief word before we descend into the lower tiers, because it matters for how you receive what's coming. The Simpsons has 788 episodes. When you produce that much content over 36 years, you inevitably create the conditions for a specific kind of fan culture, one where pattern recognition becomes its own reward, where connecting 2 unrelated scenes across 15 seasons feels like discovery. That feeling is real and it's valuable. But it can also produce theories that are built more on that feeling of discovery than on actual evidence. The lower tier theories in this ranking aren't worthless. Most of them contain at least one genuinely interesting observation. The problem is that the observation tends to get stretched, amplified, connected to things that don't connect, and eventually presented as a cohesive theory when what it actually is a single interesting scene that someone thought about for a very long time. Being honest about that isn't dismissive. It's respectful. The show has given us enough real mysteries, enough genuine buried evidence, enough actual patterns that deserve attention. We don't need to inflate the weak theories to make the strong ones feel stronger. Now, let's go to Tier F. Also, before we go any further, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. There's something genuinely lovely about knowing that someone is falling asleep to this in a city you've never been to, at an hour you're not awake for. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a good time. We're going to be here for a while, and it's better to make the journey together. Section 2, Tier F, the theories that barely hold together. Let's ease into the lower end with a theory that has a dedicated following and almost no canonical support. The idea that Springfield exists in some form of purgatory, a holding state between life and death where the residents are being tested, judged, or simply waiting for something that never arrives. You can see why this theory has appeal. Springfield is a town where nothing changes. Nobody ages, consequences don't stick, disasters happen and are forgotten. The same cycles repeat endlessly. To someone steeped in religious or philosophical frameworks, those qualities might evoke purgatory in an almost intuitive way. A place of stasis, a place without forward momentum, a place where the inhabitants are suspended between one state and another. The theory usually focuses on Homer specifically, pointing to his relationship with God, which is explicitly depicted in several episodes, and suggesting that Homer's entire life is a kind of divine test. Homer has spoken directly with God on at least 2 occasions within the show's canon. He's questioned his faith, abandoned it briefly, and returned to it. He's been given messages that seemed prophetic and survived situations that seemed miraculous. The purgatory theory reads all of that as evidence that Homer is a soul being evaluated rather than a man living his life. Here's the problem. The show never actually supports this reading in any systematic way. The conversations Homer has with God are played almost entirely for comedy. God's characterization is inconsistent across episodes because different writers handled those scenes differently. In one episode, God is warm and paternal. In another, God is somewhat bureaucratic. In another, God is absent entirely, despite the episode dealing with explicitly theological themes. There's no unified divine framework in The Simpsons because the show was never trying to build one. The purgatory reading also struggles with the sheer range of what the show depicts. If Springfield is a testing ground, what is being tested? Homer's moral character? His capacity for love? His willingness to grow? The show doesn't consistently point toward any of those as the central question of Homer's existence. Episodes undercut his growth constantly, not because his growth is being evaluated, but because the show needs him to remain the same Homer each week for structural reasons. Additionally, purgatory as a theological concept requires eventual resolution. The soul passes through. The test ends. The judgment comes. The Simpsons has no mechanism for resolution. There's no suggestion anywhere in 788 episodes that Springfield is building toward an ending, toward a release, toward anything. The stasis isn't dramatic tension. It's just stasis. The evidence score for the purgatory theory is genuinely low. 2 episodes with divine conversations, a general atmosphere of cyclical repetition, and the feeling that things should mean more than they do. Those are vibes, not evidence. Tier F. The next Tier F entry is one that circulates regularly on social media and tends to get a lot of traction because it sounds dark and specific even though it falls apart quickly on examination. The theory that Kang and Kodos, the alien characters who appear primarily in the Treehouse of Horror Halloween specials, are actually real within the show's universe and are somehow responsible for Springfield's impossible qualities, the mutations, the memory resets, the physical anomalies. This theory typically leans on 2 things. First, the fact that Kang and Kodos have appeared in non-Halloween contexts on a handful of occasions, which some fans interpret as evidence that they exist canonically rather than just as special episode characters. Second, the general weirdness of Springfield, which the theory attributes to alien experimentation or observation. The problem is foundational. The Simpsons has always maintained a distinction between its canonical universe and the Treehouse of Horror episodes. The Halloween specials are explicitly framed as non-canonical from the very beginning. Characters die in those episodes and are alive the following week without explanation. The tonal register shifts dramatically. The show is consciously using the special format as permission to ignore its own rules. The handful of non-Halloween Kang and Kodos appearances are almost universally gag appearances, quick background cameos inserted as Easter eggs for attentive fans, rather than as serious world-building. There's no episode outside the Halloween specials that treats these characters as part of Springfield's actual reality. More fundamentally, the alien experimentation theory doesn't add anything that the radiation theory doesn't already explain more elegantly, with far more canonical support. If you need an explanation for Springfield's mutations and memory resets, the power plant is right there, acknowledged explicitly across dozens of episodes, connected to every major character, supported by a mountain of evidence. Kang and Kodos don't explain anything that something else doesn't explain better. Tier F. Fun to imagine. Empty of evidence. There's a third theory in this tier that's worth examining briefly because it has a version of itself that deserves to be in a higher tier, and understanding why this version fails helps clarify what makes a good Simpsons theory in the first place. This is the theory that the entire show is a dream, but not Homer's dream specifically. Rather, the theory that it's someone else's dream entirely. Bart's dream, or Lisa's, or Maggie's. The Bart dream version typically argues that the adult world depicted in the show, the incompetent authority figures, the easily duped parents, the endlessly patient mother, the school system that clearly wasn't designed with children's well-being in mind, all of it reflects a child's fantasy projection of how adults operate rather than any realistic depiction of adulthood. Bart's parents are essentially caricatures of adult authority as seen through a child's eye. Homer is the id without restraint. Marge is the superego without limits. Teachers are villains. The principal is a fraud. The police are buffoons. This is a genuinely interesting observation about the show's satirical architecture. The problem is that calling something a dream because it reflects a child's eye view sensibility doesn't actually mean it's a dream within the show's logic. The show was designed with that sensibility as a deliberate creative choice. That's Matt Groening's aesthetic, rooted in his own childhood experiences of feeling misunderstood by a world built for adults. That's the source material. More critically, the Bart dream theory has no triggering event within the show's narrative. The Homer coma theory, which we'll spend a lot of time on later, has a specific episode with a specific incident that you can point to and say, this is where it started. The Bart dream theory has no equivalent. It's the feeling of a dream applied to the show as a whole without any internal anchor, which is to say it's interpreting tone rather than evidence. Tier F, but with a footnote. If you want a dream theory, there's a much better version of it, and we'll get there. Let's move up one level. Section 3. Tier D. Something real, not enough to build on. The Tier D theories are more interesting to sit with than the Tier F entries because they start from a real observation. There's something there. The question is whether the something is big enough to support the full weight of the theory being constructed around it. Let's begin with the theory about Sideshow Bob that has circulated in the fan community for years. The essential claim is that Sideshow Bob, whose full name is Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., is operating on a level of intelligence so far above everyone else in Springfield that his entire history on the show, all of his elaborate schemes, all of his failed attempts to kill Bart, all of his theatrical villainy can only be understood as the behavior of someone who is deliberately choosing to fail, not someone who keeps making mistakes. Someone who is engineering his own defeats because winning would remove him from the game entirely. The evidence that people point to for this theory is real and it's interesting. Sideshow Bob has a doctorate. He has been shown reading Dickens while in prison. He is fluent in multiple languages. He quotes Gilbert and Sullivan with what appears to be genuine emotional investment. Every single one of his plans to kill Bart is extraordinarily elaborate, requiring months of preparation, institutional infiltration, and, in at least one case, the relocation of an entire Italian village. And yet every plan fails at the last moment, in a way that always implicates Bob himself. He steps on rakes. He can't resist monologuing. He explains his scheme in enough detail that the explanation becomes its own undoing. The theory argues that this pattern is intentional on Bob's part, that a man of his intelligence could easily kill a 10-year-old boy if he actually wanted to. That the elaborate failures are his way of creating a performance that satisfies something in him without crossing a line he unconsciously doesn't want to cross. That Bob doesn't actually want Bart dead. He wants the relationship. He wants the adversary. He wants the game. This is psychologically sophisticated, and in some ways, it's the most human reading of Sideshow Bob that exists. It reframes him from a cartoon villain into someone more like a man addicted to the chase who would be lost without it. But here's where the evidence falls short. The show never actually supports this reading. Not once has an episode confirmed, hinted at, or given us any internal access to Bob's psychology that would validate the idea that he's deliberately sabotaging himself. The writers have explained the rake joke and the other slapstick defeats as exactly what they appear to be, comedic punchlines. Bob's intelligence is established and real, but the show uses it to make his failures funnier, not as a component of a deeper psychological portrait about self-sabotage. Furthermore, in several episodes, Bob's emotional devastation at being foiled is genuine and visibly painful. The episode where he ends up in witness protection with a family he comes to genuinely love before everything collapses gives us access to a Bob who actually wanted something other than his vendetta with Bart. The theory of deliberate failure doesn't comfortably coexist with that Bob. The observation at the heart of this theory, that a man with Bob's intelligence should be able to kill a child more efficiently, is a real observation. But it's a structural observation about comedic storytelling, not evidence of a deeper narrative. The show keeps Bob alive and failing because Bob is more useful as an ongoing antagonist than as a resolved one. That's a production reason, not a character reason. Tier D. The observation is worth making. The theory built on it doesn't hold its shape. Moving along in Tier D, let's spend some time with a theory about Nelson Muntz that tends to surface in discussions about the show's more quietly devastating character work. The theory is that Nelson's father, who was long described as having abandoned the family, is actually a background character who has been visible in Springfield scenes for years without being identified, deliberately avoiding his son, too ashamed or too broken to make contact. The canonical setup for this theory is genuinely interesting. In a late-season episode, Nelson's father reappears and the circumstances of his disappearance are explained. He didn't exactly abandon the family voluntarily. The story he tells involves a series of events, each one more improbable than the last, that kept him away from Springfield across many years. His account is played partly for absurdist comedy but also carries a real undertow of sadness. The theory suggests that before this canonical explanation, the writers were already seeding background appearances of a character who could eventually be Nelson's father, a man in the periphery of Springfield life who exists in the margins of scenes without ever being drawn into focus. The man sitting alone at Moe's, the figure visible through the window during crowd scenes, the recurring anonymous presence that nobody looks at closely. The problem is that this theory requires the writers to have been planning a specific long-term narrative payoff across many seasons, which is something The Simpsons almost never does in a disciplined way. The show's later season explanation of Nelson's father doesn't feel like the culmination of carefully planted seeds. It feels like the writers addressing a long-standing character wound because it was long overdue. The background appearances, if they exist at all, aren't deliberately coded. They're the product of a town that has a large number of recurring background characters, several of whom resemble the archetype of a broken middle-aged man. What the theory does correctly is identify something genuinely painful about Nelson's character. He is the show's most consistently heartbreaking supporting character. His home life is depicted as genuinely neglectful in ways that aren't played entirely for comedy. When the show lets Nelson be sad rather than just punchline resilient, it's affecting in a way that most of the show's emotional moments aren't, because Nelson has never been positioned as a character who's supposed to move you. The theory around his father is reaching for something real in Nelson's story. It just doesn't find the evidence to make it canonical. Tier D. There's a theory about the secondary character Disco Stu that belongs in this tier, and it's worth mentioning not because the theory itself is elaborate, but because it illustrates a pattern in how fan theories about minor characters tend to form. Disco Stu, whose full name is Stewart, is a character who appears primarily as a joke about someone stuck in a different decade, a man so devoted to the 1970s disco era that he never transitioned out of it, culturally or aesthetically. The joke is simple. He lives in the past. The theory built around this character suggests that Disco Stu is not simply a quirky Springfield resident, but rather a man who suffered some kind of significant psychological event in the 1970s, possibly the death of someone he loved or a traumatic loss, and that his inability to move on from disco is a symptom of arrested grief rather than mere eccentricity. The theory often connects this to specific background details visible in his home or clothing, suggesting that certain items are memorial rather than purely stylistic. This is the kind of theory that sounds more supported than it is, because it applies a psychologically rich framework to a character who is written as a one-note joke. There's nothing in the show that actually points toward a traumatic backstory for Disco Stew. His characterization is thin because he was never intended to carry the weight this theory places on him. Applying grief psychology to his disco devotion is an interpretive choice that reveals more about the person making the theory than about the show itself. That said, the impulse behind the theory is understandable. Springfield is full of characters who exist at the periphery and about whom we know almost nothing. The human impulse to fill that emptiness with story is natural. The error is presenting that impulse as evidence, tier D, on the generous end. Let's look at one more tier D theory before we move upward, because this one has just enough evidence to be frustrating rather than dismissible. The theory concerns Principal Skinner's genuine military history, the real Seymour Skinner, not the Armin Tamzarian version, and whether the show deliberately planted clues across early seasons that Skinner's behavior was consistent with a man living under an assumed identity rather than with the actual Vietnam veteran he claimed to be. The Armin Tamzarian episode, which we'll discuss at length later in this ranking, revealed in Season 9 that Principal Skinner was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Armin Tamzarian, and he had been living under the identity of the real Seymour Skinner, a genuine war hero, for approximately 2 decades. The theory suggests this wasn't a retroactive retcon, that the writers had seeded the Tamzarian reveal across early seasons through subtle behavioral inconsistencies in Skinner's character. The evidence people point to includes moments where Skinner seems slightly off about his own military history, moments where his relationship with Agnes seems strained in ways that a real son and mother wouldn't be strained, and moments where his institutional loyalty to the school feels less like genuine identity and more like someone performing an identity they chose rather than inherited. Here's the honest assessment. Some of those moments are real. There are early Skinner scenes that could, in retrospect, be read as the behavior of an imposter. But they could also be read as the behavior of a man who suffered significant trauma in Vietnam and returned damaged, which is the reading the show was clearly going for at the time. The inconsistencies the theory identifies are genuine, but they're the inconsistencies of a character whose writers didn't have a consistent vision for him rather than the deliberate clues of a planned narrative. The DVD commentary for the Tamzarian episode is explicit that the reveal was not planned in advance. The writers were looking for a story for Skinner and landed on this one. The fact that you can go back and find moments that fit the reveal in retrospect is a function of how much content exists and how many ways human brains can pattern match across it. Tier D, and only because the observation about Skinner's behavioral inconsistencies is real enough to acknowledge. Section 4, Tier C, genuine observations, incomplete cases. We're moving up now, and the quality of the theories improves noticeably. Tier C theories have real evidence behind them. Multiple episodes, recurring patterns, things the show has explicitly depicted rather than merely suggested. The limitation of the Tier C theories is that the evidence, while real, doesn't fully close the gap. There are holes, counter-arguments, or the theory requires a certain interpretive leap that not everyone will accept. Let's start with one of the most popular and widely discussed theories in this category. The idea that the Simpsons' predictions of future events are not coincidental, but reflect a deliberate, ongoing practice by the writers of embedding real projections about where American culture and technology were heading. The case for this theory is built on a list that has been growing for decades. In the year 2000, The Simpsons depicted a Trump presidency 16 years before the 2016 election. In 1995, the show depicted a device functionally similar to a smartwatch. In 1998, a background equation in one of Homer's scenes turned out to be remarkably close to the Higgs boson mass calculation that physicists wouldn't confirm experimentally until 2012. In 1993, a flu virus originating from Asia spreads through Springfield in a way that maps loosely onto the COVID-19 pandemic's early dynamics. In 1996, a joke about Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra became reality in 2024 when that exact collaboration happened. In 1998, the show depicted Disney acquiring 20th Century Fox, which happened in 2019. The list goes on for a while. The intentional prediction theory argues that the show's writing staff, which has historically included a remarkable concentration of people with graduate degrees in mathematics, sciences, and political theory from elite universities, was not simply making lucky guesses but was engaging in disciplined extrapolation based on real data. That they were reading trajectory lines in culture, technology, and economics and following them forward to their logical endpoints, depicting those endpoints in satirical form decades before they arrived. The evidence for this theory is real in the sense that the predictions are real. The Trump prediction is the strongest example because it's specific rather than general. The show didn't predict that a celebrity would become president. It predicted Trump, by name, and depicted his escalator descent in a sequence that mirrors the imagery of his actual 2015 campaign announcement. That's not a general trend observation. That's a specific thing. The Higgs boson equation is another strong example because it's not cultural intuition, it's mathematics. Someone on the writing staff wrote an equation onto a background chalkboard that turned out to be surprisingly close to the actual mass calculation. That requires either extraordinary coincidence or someone who knew enough about particle physics to make an educated guess. So why is this only tier C rather than higher? Because the explanation the show's own producers have offered is credible and sufficient for most of the predictions. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer since the beginning, has said explicitly that the show generates so many satirical observations per episode, across so many episodes, that some percentage of them will align with future events through probability alone. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during its peak creative years, has said that most of the predictions are explained by the cyclical nature of history, rather than any special knowledge. These aren't deflections. They're statistically defensible explanations. Furthermore, the phenomenon is heavily filtered by confirmation bias. Nobody tracks the predictions that didn't come true. Nobody makes viral posts about the episode where Springfield developed jetpack technology that still doesn't exist, or the future timeline where certain political outcomes went differently. The hits are remembered and shared. The misses disappear. When you run that filter over 788 episodes containing thousands of satirical observations, the surviving list looks prophetic, even if the original batting average was ordinary. The Cypress Hill collaboration is also interesting for a different reason. It happened in 2024, 28 years after the joke. That's long enough that the joke itself had become a cultural reference point. It's at least plausible that the people organizing that event knew about the Simpsons joke and were, consciously or not, influenced by it. In which case the show didn't predict the event so much as inspire it. The honest middle position on this theory is that the writing staff's unusual concentration of academic talent makes their cultural predictions more accurate than average, which is a real and meaningful observation, but that the idea of deliberate, sustained, accurate forecasting significantly overstates what the evidence demonstrates. Tier C? But a strong tier C. The truth inside this theory is real, even if the full version of it isn't. Let's stay in Tier C and talk about Mo Sislak, because Mo has accumulated a genuinely interesting collection of theories, most of which are weakly supported, but one of which has enough canonical weight to deserve serious attention. The theory is that Mo is not who he presents himself to be, that behind the bar owner persona there is a significant hidden history that the show has been gesturing toward for years without ever fully resolving. This isn't a theory about Mo having a secret identity in the Armin Tamzarian sense. It's subtler than that. The theory observes that Mo's backstory has been inconsistently told across the series in ways that suggest the writers were deliberately layering in contradictions rather than simply making continuity errors. Mo has claimed across different episodes to have been a child actor, a boxing champion, a man with a deeply troubled relationship to a past he won't describe directly, and someone who left a previous life behind when he came to Springfield. The canonical support for the theory comes from the episode that depicts Mo's childhood, where he is shown as a young boy from a humble background who is used as a prop in a children's television show and then discarded. This episode is legitimately affecting, and it does establish a foundation of early trauma and exploitation that could reasonably explain certain aspects of Moe's adult character. The way he clings to the small community of regulars at his bar, his occasional, surprising capacity for genuine tenderness beneath layers of self-loathing. The show's suggestion, never fully articulated, that Moe knows what it feels like to be disposable. The boxing history is separately established and creates a picture of someone who was, at one point, capable of significant physical achievement, someone whose body was once an instrument of something rather than just the vehicle for a life of mediocre bitterness. What the theory argues, in its strongest form, is that Moe is the show's most deliberately tragic supporting character, and that the contradictions in his backstory aren't continuity errors, but rather the writers circling around something they wanted to say about him without ever quite committing to saying it directly. That the many versions of Moe's history are fragments of a real history that the show was too cautious or too comedically committed to assemble into a coherent whole. This is genuinely possible. The show has treated Moe with unusual emotional care in its best episodes. The scene where he briefly experiences success with a cocktail he invents and then loses it again is one of the show's most quietly sad scenes. The episode where he becomes genuinely fulfilled while working as a children's entertainer is affecting precisely because it shows you what Moe could have been if things had gone differently. But the evidence for a deliberately hidden, coherent backstory, as opposed to a character who has been written differently by different writers across different seasons, is limited. The Simpsons doesn't have the kind of writer's room continuity discipline that would make long-term narrative planning for a supporting character plausible. Moe's contradictory history is more consistent with a character who gets a new backstory whenever an episode needs one than with a character whose true history is being carefully withheld. Tier C. Moe deserves better than the show gave him. The theory that this was intentional is a kindness to the writing room that the evidence doesn't fully support. There's one more Tier C theory to cover before we move to higher ground, and this one is interesting because it concerns something the show does visually rather than narratively. The theory about the recurring color of doom, specifically the observation that whenever a character or situation is about to enter a phase of serious deterioration in The Simpsons, the show uses a specific palette shift, a slight desaturation combined with a cooler blue undertone, in the background lighting of scenes, that functions as a kind of visual foreshadowing for attentive viewers. This theory has been developed primarily through frame-by-frame analysis of episodes during which significant negative events occur, and the people who have done that analysis have found what appears to be a pattern. The lighting in the moments before something goes seriously wrong in Springfield is subtly different from the lighting in baseline scenes. Not dramatically different, not in a way that announces itself, but consistently different enough that once you know to look for it, you start seeing it. The canonical support here is limited by the nature of what it would take to confirm it. Visual analysis of this kind requires access to original broadcast masters rather than compressed streaming versions, and most of the analysis that's been done has used streaming quality footage. Compression artifacts can create apparent color shifts that aren't in the original. This is a genuine methodological problem. Additionally, the shift in question would need to be demonstrated to be intentional rather than incidental. Animation pipelines are complex and involve many hands. Color work in any given episode might be slightly different from another episode simply because different colorists were working different weeks. The pattern, if real, might be the signature of a specific colorist's approach rather than a deliberate storytelling device. The honest answer is that this theory identifies something real, that The Simpsons does use visual language, and that its production design communicates mood in sophisticated ways that many viewers don't consciously register, but that the specific claim of a deliberate pre-doom palette signature is more than the available evidence can confidently support. Tier C, worth continuing to investigate. Can't be rated higher without better evidence. Extended section Tier F, continued. The timeline conspiracy theory, and other bottom-tier entries examined at length. Before we leave the bottom tiers entirely, there are several more Tier F and Tier D theories that have circulated widely enough to deserve honest treatment. Each one contains something worth acknowledging before we explain why it doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The timeline conspiracy theory is one that surfaces regularly in fan discussion and has a surface plausibility that makes it feel more convincing than it is. The theory begins from a genuine observation, that The Simpsons exists in two separate layers of time that occasionally contradict each other in revealing ways. The first layer is the narrative present, which is always contemporary with the episode's air date. The second layer is the established character history, which includes childhood memories, origin stories, and formative experiences that the characters reference across multiple episodes. The theory argues that these two layers are not simply in tension with each other due to production oversight, but that they are deliberately kept inconsistent as a way of signaling something deeper about Springfield's relationship to time itself. The specific evidence people point to includes moments where Homer's childhood memories seem to span different eras, where Marge references experiences that couldn't have occurred in the timeline established by previous episodes, and where characters seem to have double memories, two versions of the same event that are mutually exclusive. The theory reads these inconsistencies not as errors but as deliberate fractures, moments where the show is telling you that time in Springfield doesn't behave the way it does elsewhere. This is an interesting observation wrapped around a flawed premise. The inconsistencies are real. The floating timeline genuinely does create a situation where the backstory keeps drifting forward as the present tense advances. What the theory misidentifies is the cause. These contradictions exist because different writers worked on different episodes across different years, without always consulting the existing canon carefully. The show's writer's room, while talented, was not operating with the continuity discipline of a serialized drama. Episodes were written largely as standalone units, with backstory elements introduced when needed rather than carefully maintained. The idea that the inconsistencies are deliberate signals requires the show to have been orchestrating something specific with them, and there's no evidence for that coordination. No writer has ever confirmed an intention to fracture the timeline deliberately. No episode has ever positioned a continuity contradiction in a way that draws attention to it as meaningful. The fractures happen and the show moves on without acknowledgement, which is consistent with production oversight rather than deliberate design. What makes this a Tier F theory rather than a Tier D one is that the observation it's built on, the inconsistency of the backstory, is better explained by the floating timeline theory we'll spend more time with later in the ranking, and by normal production variability, than by any deliberate signaling. The simpler explanation fits the evidence better. The Springfield Underground theory is another Tier F entry that has a devoted following, particularly among fans who have done extensive analysis of background details in the show's more elaborate environments. The theory argues that Springfield has a significant underground infrastructure, bunkers, tunnels, hidden facilities, that connects the town's major institutions and provides physical evidence of the conspiracy being run from beneath the surface. The nuclear plant connects to the town hall. The town hall connects to Burns's mansion. The mansion connects to facilities that don't appear on any official map of Springfield. The evidence for this theory comes primarily from background art analysis. Specific moments in specific episodes where doorways or passages seem to lead somewhere that the scene never follows, and from the episode where Burns's mansion is depicted with what appears to be a more extensive subterranean level than the narrative acknowledges. The theory suggests that Burns's power over Springfield is maintained not just economically and politically, but through literal underground architecture, that the machinery of control is physical and spatial. This is a genuinely creative theory, and it has a kind of atmospheric logic to it. Burns is the type of character who would have built underground infrastructure. His personality is consistent with the kind of paranoid, contingency-obsessed wealthy man who prepares for every scenario. The show has given us Burns's mansion as a space of extraordinary complexity, and there are certainly moments where background details in that space suggest more than the narrative explicitly shows. But the underground infrastructure, as a systematic conspiracy, requires much more evidence than background art ambiguity can provide. Animation backgrounds are frequently repurposed and modified across episodes, which means the apparent continuity between different underground spaces in different episodes may be a function of shared asset use rather than deliberate world building. The theory reads coherence into what may be production convenience. Additionally, Burns's power over Springfield doesn't require physical underground infrastructure to be explained. The economic and political mechanisms are explicit and sufficient. The underground theory doesn't add explanatory power. It adds atmosphere. Tier F. The Barney Gumble tragic backstory theory deserves more attention than it usually gets, and its placement in Tier D rather than Tier F reflects the fact that the show actually does support part of what the theory claims. Barney is Homer's oldest friend and the town drunk. He exists in the show as a lovable depiction of alcoholic decline, always at Moe's, always with a drink, always generating the specific kind of warmth and sadness that chronic alcoholism creates when depicted with genuine affection rather than cruelty. What the theory observes, and what the show actually canonically established in one episode, is that Barney was not always this person. In a flashback, we see a young Barney who is not the man we know. He is focused, capable, and apparently planning to attend university. He had a trajectory. He had a future. And then Homer offered him a beer at a party, and Barney, who had apparently never drunk alcohol before, took it. That's canonical. The show explicitly established that Homer's casual act of offering a beer to a sober person at a party was the triggering event for Barney's alcoholism. Homer initiated Barney's destruction without intending to, without knowing he was doing it, and without ever being held accountable for it within the show's narrative. Barney's entire life, the decades of bar stools and wasted potential, traces directly back to that single moment. The theory extends this into a broader argument about Barney as a character, suggesting that there are recurring visual and behavioral cues throughout the show that indicate Barney's awareness of his own decline, that he is not simply a jolly drunk but a man who knows exactly what he lost and why. The theory reads his warmth toward Homer not as uncomplicated friendship, but as the complex emotional mathematics of someone who both genuinely loves a person and knows that person is the reason everything went wrong. This is where the theory earns its Tier D placement rather than F. The canonical support for Barney's prior sobriety and capability is real. The reading of his relationship with Homer as emotionally layered is supported by moments in the show that play Barney's pathos more carefully than a simple background drunk would warrant. But the theory of Barney's conscious awareness of Homer's causal role in his decline requires inferring interior psychological complexity that the show doesn't confirm. Barney has had sober periods, including a notable arc where he gets sober and pursues filmmaking, suggesting his character has depth, but the specific reading of his relationship with Homer, as tinged by this specific knowledge, is largely an inference. Tier D. The observation is real. The full theory is a reach. Let us spend some time with the theory that has probably generated more discourse than any other secondary character theory in the show's history. The Lisa is the only real person theory. The argument, in its most developed form, is that Lisa Simpson is the only character in the show whose intelligence, emotional complexity, and self-awareness are sufficient to qualify as genuine human consciousness in the way the show's universe actually operates. Everyone else, from Homer through the widest supporting cast, is either a simplified type or a function. A character who exists to serve a narrative purpose rather than to exist for their own sake. Lisa alone is truly present. This theory is interesting precisely because it's hard to argue against from within the show's logic. Lisa is consistently the most self-aware character. She is the one who notices when things don't add up. She is the one who tries to address systemic problems while everyone around her treats those problems as either normal or invisible. In the episodes that deal most directly with Springfield's darker qualities, environmental destruction, institutional corruption, the exploitation of the powerless by the powerful, it is almost always Lisa who perceives the problem clearly, and Lisa who pays the price for her perception. The theory sometimes extends into a claim that Lisa is the only character who is genuinely suffering within the show's universe, that everyone else's suffering is either comic or functional while Lisa's is real, and therefore somehow more morally serious. In this reading, the show is secretly a story about the experience of being the only fully conscious person in a world of types, the specific loneliness of intelligence in a community that doesn't value it. The canonical support for the observation is real. Lisa is the show's most consistent moral center. Her intelligence is established as exceptional. Her isolation is depicted with care and sympathy. The moments where Lisa is genuinely moved by something, by music, by a moment of unexpected connection, by a glimpse of a different kind of life, are among the show's most affecting passages. The theory falters when it tries to make a metaphysical claim out of a characterization observation. The show gives Lisa more interiority than it gives Homer, not because Homer lacks genuine consciousness within the show's universe, but because Homer's interiority, such as it is expressed through action and appetite rather than reflection. Homer's love for his family is not less real for being less articulate. The show makes this explicit in many of its best episodes. Homer is capable of genuine love, genuine sacrifice, genuine growth, even if those capacities are expressed in an idiosyncratic register. The Lisa theory is better understood as an observation about the show's narrative architecture than as a claim about consciousness. Lisa is the character through whose eyes the show most often invites us to see Springfield clearly. That's a formal role. It doesn't ontologically elevate her above the others. Tier D for the strong version. The observation about Lisa's unique narrative position is worth keeping. Extended section Tier C continued. The Springfield media theory, and the question of who controls information in Springfield. There's a Tier C theory that hasn't received as much attention as it deserves, largely because it doesn't have a catchy name. The theory concerns Kent Brockman and the Springfield media apparatus, and its argument is that the show has been depicting a consistently controlled information environment in Springfield, one where the local media is either directly owned by or functionally deferential to Burns's interests, in ways that materially contribute to the population's inability to form accurate beliefs about their own situation. Kent Brockman is Springfield's primary television news anchor. He appears frequently throughout the series, and his characterization is consistent. A man who is vain, credulous, self-interested, easily frightened, and willing to say whatever will get the best audience reaction regardless of its factual basis. He has declared alien invasion based on misinterpreted footage. He has changed his expressed political allegiances mid-broadcast based on apparent immediate incentives. He has treated trivial matters as crises and legitimate crises as entertainment. He is, in the show's own words, not a journalist. He is a television performer who occupies the space where journalism should be. The theory argues that this isn't simply a satirical characterization of celebrity news culture. It's a depiction of what a media environment looks like, when the person with the most to hide also has the most influence over what gets broadcast. Burns has explicit financial connections to Springfield's media infrastructure across multiple episodes. The theory compiles these connections and argues that they form a coherent pattern. Burns doesn't need to directly censor the news because the news has already been made to serve his interests by the incentive structures he controls. The canonical support is moderate. The specific connections are real. Burns has influenced Springfield's media more than once in ways that are canonical rather than implied. Brockman's credulous and incentive-responsive character is consistently depicted. The correlation between the topics Springfield's media covers and the topics that would benefit from non-coverage, the contamination, the violations, the three-eyed fish follow-up studies that never happened, is real. What keeps this at Tier C rather than higher is that the media critique is a background element of the show rather than a foregrounded narrative. The show's media satire is real and substantive, but it's aimed at television news culture broadly, rather than specifically at Burns's control of information. Brockman's awfulness is not depicted as the product of a specific managed relationship with Burns. It's depicted as the product of being Brockman. The systemic reading is available, but it requires connecting dots that the show doesn't connect for you. Tier C. The observation is correct. The controlled information theory is more specific than the evidence fully supports. The Springfield geography theory deserves a full extended treatment because its evidence is more interesting than most Tier C entries, and because the way the show handles Springfield's location is genuinely strange when you examine it carefully. Springfield has no fixed state. This is established and canonical. The show has deliberately contradicted itself about Springfield's location across its entire run. An episode places it in the north, another places it in the south. An episode establishes it near an ocean. Another places it near mountains. Another puts it in farmland. Springfield has simultaneously bordered Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you're watching. It has both a coastline and an inland position. Its weather ranges from Arctic to tropical within a single season. This is not an accident of production or a failure of continuity management. The writers have been asked about it many times, and the answer is always some version of intentionality. The show doesn't want Springfield to have a fixed location. Springfield is designed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Matt Groening, in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine, confirmed that he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up near. For about 48 hours, it appeared the mystery was solved. But the show continued to contradict that answer immediately afterward. Episodes aired that placed Springfield in geographic contexts incompatible with Oregon. The writers didn't honor Groening's confession. The mystery remained deliberately alive. The surface explanation is that Springfield is a composite American town, drawn from every American community rather than modeled on one, designed to feel familiar to everyone regardless of where they grew up. This is true, and it is the intentional design philosophy. But it doesn't fully account for the specific quality of Springfield's geographic impossibility, which goes beyond universal familiarity into something that approaches deliberate evasion. Under the theories we've been discussing, Springfield's geographic indefiniteness takes on different meanings depending on which framework you apply. The radiation theory suggests that the contamination doesn't just affect biology. If the physical laws of Springfield's universe have been warped by decades of nuclear exposure to such a degree that people's bodies deviate from biological norms, why should geography be exempt? The mountains are close to the ocean because the contamination has altered the spatial relationships of the physical landscape itself. This is a stretch even within the radiation theory, but it has a certain internal logic. The coma theory offers a more emotionally resonant explanation. Homer's dreaming brain doesn't have a precise cartographic map of America in its memory. It has impressions, feelings, fragments of every place Homer ever visited or saw on television. Mountains from a family vacation, oceans from a commercial, deserts from a movie, the flat expanse of farmland from driving through the Midwest on a trip. His unconscious mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape he ever encountered, layering them on top of each other without regard for geographic reality. Because dreams don't respect geography. Dreams have emotional logic rather than physical logic. And Springfield feels like the right kind of American town because it's built from Homer's emotional memory of what America felt like. The collective denial theory offers the most structurally interesting answer. Springfield's geographic uncertainty is, within that framework, a legal and regulatory advantage. You cannot hold a nuclear facility accountable to state regulations if the state is undefined. You cannot bring charges against a power plant if the jurisdiction keeps changing. The EPA can seal the town under a dome in the movie because it's a federal agency with national jurisdiction. But state-level accountability, the kind that would be most immediately applicable to a local industrial facility with 342 violations, requires knowing what state you're in. If the state is perpetually ambiguous, the regulatory framework is perpetually undefined. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means a fixed regulatory authority. Landing means consistent oversight. Landing means someone with a badge and a map can show up at the plant and start asking specific legal questions about specific violations in a specific jurisdiction. Floating means those questions can always be referred elsewhere. It's somebody else's EPA region. It's a different state's attorney general. The ball never lands in anyone's court because the court keeps moving. The Behind the Laughter episode, a season 12 mockumentary about the Simpsons family framed as a VH1-style retrospective, appeared to finally settle the question. In the original broadcast, Springfield's location was identified as Northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed. The answer literally depends on which version of the episode you're watching. The show gave you an answer and then changed the answer retroactively. Even Springfield's moments of apparent geographic definitiveness turn out to be provisional. This is the show's most sophisticated joke, and it's also, under the theories, its most sophisticated cover story. The funniest thing about Springfield's location is that it doesn't exist. The darkest thing about Springfield's location is that the ambiguity serves someone very well. Tier C+ for the geographic theory, because the legal regulatory dimension is genuinely suggestive, though the evidence for deliberate regulatory evasion through geographic ambiguity is inferential rather than explicit. Extended section deeper into Tier B, the Bart theory. Bart as the show's most honest character. Bart Simpson rarely comes up in conspiracy theory discussions because his character seems, on the surface, to be the most straightforwardly read one in the show. He's 10. He's a troublemaker. He resists authority. He loves his family even when he won't admit it. He's the id of the Simpson household, the disruptive force that sets plots in motion and keeps the narrative from ever settling into pure domesticity. But there's a reading of Bart's character that deserves a Tier B ranking because it's supported by substantial canonical evidence, and because it reframes his behavior from chaos for its own sake into something more purposeful. The theory, Bart's resistance to authority, his pranks, his refusals, his delinquency, are not the product of a bad kid or a kid with behavioral issues. They are the appropriate response of a perceptive child to a world that has been built to exploit him and everyone around him. Bart sees Springfield clearly in ways that his age makes more natural than they would be for an adult. Children haven't yet been socialized into the kinds of institutional deference and motivated blindness that make adults ignore what Bart keeps pointing at. The canonical support for this theory runs through every episode that places Bart in direct opposition to an institutional authority and reveals, by the end, that the institution was wrong. Principal Skinner is revealed across multiple episodes to be either corrupt, self-interested, or simply wrong. The school system is shown repeatedly to be more interested in compliance than in education. The police are buffoons who protect the powerful and neglect the vulnerable. The church is run by a man who is earnest but occasionally complicit in the very systems that harm his congregation. Bart's rebellions consistently, not always but consistently, turn out to be responses to genuine wrongness rather than simple acts of defiance for their own sake. He vandalizes things that deserve to be vandalized. He exposes things that deserve to be exposed. He refuses to comply with things that genuine compliance would harm. The theory goes further than this baseline observation. It argues that Bart's relationship with Sideshow Bob, his recurring nemesis, is the show's most honest depiction of what it looks like when a child refuses to participate in his own destruction. Bob wants to kill Bart. The show presents this as comedy. But Bob is also, in every episode that features him, the representative of a specific class of harm. The harm done by intelligent, privileged people who decide that someone beneath them in the social order deserves to be removed. Bob went to Yale. Bob speaks 4 languages. Bob has high cultural refinement and genuine talent. And he has decided that a 10-year-old street kid from the working class deserves to die. Bart's survival of every Sideshow Bob encounter is not simply cartoon resilience. Within the theory, it's the show's consistent argument that this particular form of elite contempt for the ordinary, the conviction that someone like Bob is simply entitled to remove someone like Bart, doesn't ultimately prevail. Bart survives not because he's physically superior to Bob, but because he's more connected to the actual world he lives in. Bob's elaborate plans always fail at the point of contact with ordinary reality, because ordinary reality is where Bart lives and where Bob doesn't. There's also the theory's emotional dimension. Bart loves Homer in a way that the show consistently obscures behind the strangling gag and the surface comedy of their relationship. But in the show's best Homer-Bart episodes, when the comedy drops away and the actual relationship is visible, what you find is a boy who has organized his entire emotional life around winning the approval of a father who genuinely doesn't know how to give it consistently. Bart's pranks are attention. His resistance is engagement. His refusal to comply is a version of the same need that Lisa meets through achievement and Maggie meets through silence. He's asking to be seen. The theory suggests that Bart's 10-year-old status, frozen across 36 years, is the show's most poignant application of the aging freeze. It's not simply that the floating timeline keeps Bart 10. It's that Bart at 10 is specifically the age at which a child is old enough to perceive his world clearly, but young enough to not yet have learned to participate in its corruptions. If Bart ages, if he becomes 11, 12, 18, the clarity of his vision starts to be compromised by the same socialization processes that compromised everyone around him. At 10, he can still see the machine. At 20, he might be working for it. Keeping Bart 10 is keeping the show's most honest observer alive. This earns Tier B because the canonical support is real and distributed across the show's run, but the full theory requires an interpretive commitment that goes beyond what the show explicitly states. The show doesn't tell you that Bart's rebellions are systematically correct rather than randomly destructive. It shows you a mix. Some of his acts of resistance lead to something good, some lead to nothing. The theory selects for the meaningful rebellions and builds a systematic reading on them. which is an interpretive choice rather than a factual reading. Tier B. Bart is more right than the show usually lets him be. Extended section. The deeper dimensions of the Burns conspiracy and the question of deliberate population management. We've discussed Burns's immortality at the B+ level and the Mona Simpson story at the A level. But there is a dimension of the Burns conspiracy that spans both theories and deserves its own extended treatment. The question of whether Burns has been deliberately managing Springfield's population not just economically and politically, but cognitively. The conventional reading of Burns's relationship to Homer's incompetence is that Homer is an accident of bad hiring. Burns hired Homer, Homer turned out to be catastrophically incompetent. Burns kept him on because the German investor episode established that replacing Homer would require acknowledging the violations he'd been ignoring. This reading treats Homer's continued employment as a structural necessity that Burns manages rather than an arrangement Burns engineered. The theory being examined here argues for something darker, that Burns understood from early on what kind of employee Homer was and what Homer's continued employment would produce. That a safety inspector who actively fails to inspect is more valuable to Burns than no safety inspector at all. No inspector means the plant has no plausible deniability about its safety record. An inspector who consistently fails to identify problems gives the plant a documented inspection history without any of the compliance costs that real inspection would require. Homer doesn't just allow the violations to continue through incompetence. Homer's incompetence provides regulatory cover for the violations. The plant was inspected. The inspector found nothing serious. Therefore, the plant must be safe. Homer is a human piece of paperwork, a certified safety official who certifies that everything is fine while everything continues to leak. This is a Tier A observation because the German investor episode makes it canonical. When the German investors fired Homer and tried to bring the plant up to code, the estimated compliance costs were catastrophic. Burns's subsequent repurchase of the plant and immediate rehiring of Homer is not sentimentality. Burns isn't fond of Homer. Burns can barely remember Homer's name. He rehired Homer because Homer's reinstatement was the fastest way to restore the compliance theater that the plant needs to operate. But the theory goes further. The deliberate population management argument asks whether Burns's strategy extends beyond Homer to the population of Springfield as a whole. If decades of radiation exposure have produced cognitive effects consistent with what the show depicts, decreased critical thinking, compromised memory, reduced capacity for institutional resistance, then these effects are favorable to Burns's interests regardless of whether Burns engineered them. The population that results from the contamination is the population most likely to continue working at the plant, to vote for Burns-friendly politicians, to accept the official version of events, and to forget the things that should be remembered. Whether Burns engineered these effects or simply recognized and exploited them is the question the show leaves open. The difference matters morally, but not practically. Either way, the contamination continues, the effects persist, and Burns benefits. There is one episode that pushes this beyond coincidence in a direction the theory finds significant. In a season 20 episode, Burns is shown to have files on every resident of Springfield. Detailed personal files, information about their medical histories, their psychological vulnerabilities, their financial pressures, their family situations. Burns has been observing Springfield's population with an attentiveness that goes far beyond what a normal employer would maintain about the workers in his town. He knows things about people that they haven't told anyone. Within the theory, this surveillance infrastructure is the practical mechanism through which Burns manages the population's behavior. He doesn't need to control what people think because he has enough information about each person to apply targeted pressure when needed. The cognitive damage from the contamination makes people easier to manage. The surveillance files make individual management efficient when the general cognitive impairment isn't sufficient. Between the two systems, Burns maintains control not through dramatic coercion, but through the quiet management of a population that doesn't fully understand what's being done to it. The crayon in Homer's brain fits here in a way that the show never fully draws out. Who in Springfield's medical establishment knew about that crayon? The show establishes that doctors in Springfield treated Homer across decades and none of them found it. The theory asks whether that's possible without deliberate non-finding. A crayon in a brain would show up in basic imaging. Standard medical practice for a patient with Homer's cognitive profile would include neurological investigation, The only reason a crayon remains lodged in a brain across decades of medical contact is if the medical professionals involved were either catastrophically negligent or were not looking for what they should have been looking for. If Burns's influence extends into Springfield's healthcare infrastructure, if the medical establishment has been operating under implicit incentives to not find certain things in certain patients, then Homer's crayon is not an oversight. It's a maintained condition. And a Homer with a crayon in his brain is a Homer who can work at a nuclear plant for 30 years without asking the questions that would shut the plant down. This extended reading pushes the Burns conspiracy to the edge of what the canonical evidence will support. The surveillance files are real. The crayon is real. The German investor episode is real. The managed incompetence is real. The question of deliberate cognitive management is inferred from those real elements, which keeps it at tier A rather than tier S. But the inference is not a stretch. It follows from the established pattern with uncomfortable directness. Extended section: The religious dimensions of Springfield, and the Ned Flanders theory fully developed. The earlier section on Ned Flanders touched on the major elements of his tragic characterization, but the religious dimension of Springfield deserves extended treatment because the show's theology, such as it is a genuine element of the world it's built, and the theories around it are more substantive than they're usually given credit for. Springfield has a functioning church. Reverend Lovejoy presides over it with a combination of genuine pastoral concern and what the show depicts as the occupational exhaustion of a man who has been listening to Ned Flanders's theological anxieties for decades. Lovejoy's characterization is interesting because he clearly started with genuine conviction and has been slowly eroded by the specific conditions of ministry in a town like Springfield. The episode where he rediscovers his faith through unlikely circumstances is affecting because it reminds you that Lovejoy didn't always look this tired. The show's theology is deliberately inconsistent in ways that reflect the inconsistencies of real American religious life rather than any coherent theological position. God exists and is accessible. God has spoken to Homer on multiple occasions. God has specific aesthetic preferences and a sense of humor. God operates within the show's universe as a genuine, if slightly ineffable presence. Religion is not depicted as fraudulent. It's depicted as real, complicated, and frequently disappointing to its most dedicated practitioners. The Ned theory's theological dimension runs as follows. Ned has dedicated his life to a God who demonstrably exists within the show's universe. This is not faith in the absence of evidence. Ned's Springfield is a town where God has confirmed his existence to multiple residents. Ned knows people who have spoken to God directly. The existence of God is, within Springfield's logic, more empirically established than the existence of most things. And God has never spoken to Ned. Homer talks to God while lying on his couch, avoiding church. Homer talks to God during a vision sequence. Homer is given divine conversation because Homer, in his chaotic and unintentional way, seems to attract the kind of comic cosmic attention that the show's universe distributes based on narrative necessity rather than moral standing. Homer is at the center of events. Things happen to Homer. God participates in the things that happen to Homer. Ned is not at the center of events. Ned is the neighbor, the support character, the man who exists to provide contrast with Homer and to absorb punishment that illustrates something about the world's indifference to goodness. God doesn't speak to Ned because Ned isn't the protagonist. But within Ned's experience, within the show's universe as he inhabits it, the silence is inexplicable. He has done everything. He believes everything. He follows every rule he knows. And the God who talks to Homer, who has conversations with Homer about the nature of existence and the meaning of life, has never extended that courtesy to the man who built his entire life around deserving it. The cruelest version of the Ned theory observes that Ned's conditioning as a child removed his capacity for anger before he could choose whether to keep it. The psychiatrist who reprogrammed his behavior gave him kindness and patience as survival mechanisms, but also took from him the protective function that anger performs. Anger, in psychologically healthy form, is the signal that something is wrong. It's the system that says, this situation is damaging me and I need to change it. Ned's anger was conditioned away before it could develop into that signal. Without it, he has no internal mechanism for recognizing when a situation is genuinely harmful and needs to be escaped rather than endured. The The result is a man who endures everything with a smile that is not peace, but rather the expression of a nervous system that cannot authorize suffering to matter enough to act on. Ned doesn't forgive Homer for Maude's death because he chose forgiveness in full knowledge of what he was forgiving. He forgives because his nervous system was rewired to suppress the signal that would have told him forgiveness was not always appropriate here, that some things are not something you just move past. His faith provides the framework that allows this to continue. If everything is part of God's plan, then Maude's death is part of God's plan. If suffering has meaning, then his suffering has meaning. If patience and grace are virtues, then he is virtuous rather than damaged. His theology is doing the work of containing what his reprogramming cannot contain alone. The two systems reinforce each other. The conditioning suppresses the anger. The theology explains the suffering. Between them, Ned remains functional in a situation that should not be functional to remain in. The show knows this. The hurricane episode reveals it. When both systems fail simultaneously, when the conditioning buckles under the accumulating weight and the theology can no longer absorb the cognitive dissonance, what emerges is not simple rage, but the specific despair of a man who did everything right and received nothing for it. The screaming in the hurricane episode is not anger. It's the sound of a man realizing for the first time that the system he trusted to protect him was never going to protect him, and that he was not equipped with the tools to save himself. He is institutionalized and fixed. The conditioning is restored. He returns to Springfield and continues. And across the fence, Homer eats a donut and is fine. The gap between them has never been the gap between a good man and a bad one. It's the gap between a man the system was built for and a man the system was built upon. Homer's ease is the ease of someone who fits the specifications. Ned's suffering is the suffering of someone who was made to fit specifications that were never going to reward him. The show puts them next door to each other and lets them live that relationship for 36 years. It is one of the most sustained observations about the relationship between goodness and fortune that American television has ever produced. It just produced it through the medium of a cartoon where Homer falls off things and lands on his face. Extended section. The fuller dimensions of the Homer coma theory, what the dream tells us about the dreamer. We've ranked the Homer coma theory at tier A and laid out the primary evidence for it. But the theory has dimensions that deserve more space than the main entry gave them, because those dimensions are where the theory's emotional intelligence lives. The dream theory requires you to think about what a coma dream actually is. Not in the clinical sense, though that's worth considering too. In the narrative sense, if Homer's mind has been generating the post-1993 Simpsons episodes as a sustained dream, then every element of those episodes is a product of Homer's unconscious priorities, fears, and desires. The dream doesn't show you random content. It shows you what the dreamer cares about. What does Homer care about? The dream's content answers this clearly. He cares about his family above everything else. The show is fundamentally about the Simpson family. Every episode, no matter how far it ranges into celebrity encounters or international travel or supernatural events, returns to the family, returns to the house on Evergreen Terrace, returns to the dinner table and the couch and the relationships that define Homer's life at its most fundamental level. The dream never lets the family dissolve. Even in episodes where the family is in conflict, even in the episodes that deal with marital tension or parental failure or sibling rivalry, the family holds, the structure holds, the house remains standing. This is not because Springfield is a stable place. Springfield is demonstrably unstable. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Nothing outside the family stays constant, but the family is the fixed point around which everything else orbits. In the coma theory, this is the dreaming mind's most fundamental operation, maintaining the thing that matters most. Homer can't hold his children. He can't have a conversation with Marge. He can't do any of the ordinary physical things that constitute the experience of being with your family. But the dream can. The dream can hold the family in place indefinitely. The dream can give him dinner conversations and Sunday evenings, and the sound of Bart's voice, and the sight of Lisa with her saxophone, and the weight of Maggie in his arms. The dream has everything the hospital room doesn't. The escalating fantasy content of later seasons takes on a different quality under this lens. Homer goes to space. Homer meets the president. Homer travels to dozens of countries. Homer has extraordinary adventures. In the conventional reading, this is the show losing discipline and escalating beyond what its characters and premise can support. In the coma theory, these escalations are the dream responding to the dreamer's need. As the years in the coma accumulate, as the hope of waking grows dimmer, the dream has to work harder to sustain itself. It needs to be more vivid, more intense, more extraordinary to maintain the dreamer's engagement. The brain generates higher stakes content to keep itself dreaming rather than shutting down. The celebrity appearances serve this function too. Homer's hospital room has a television. His family visits and talks. He receives ambient stimuli from the world outside the coma, fragments of names and voices and cultural moments, and the dreaming brain incorporates them. Each celebrity who appears in Springfield is a fragment Homer's mind received and wove into the fabric of the dream. Every famous face at Moe's bar is a voice heard through the fog and given a body by a dreaming mind doing everything it can to stay alive. The episodes that feel most like filler, the ones where Homer has a new job, meets new people, goes somewhere unusual for no particular reason, these episodes have a specific quality in the coma reading. They feel like a mind-spinning content to fill time. The dream keeps generating new scenarios not because there's a meaningful story to be told about Homer as a bowling instructor or as a member of a barbershop quartet, but because the dream needs to keep running. It generates content the way a generator generates power. As long as it's running, something is being produced. The quality varies, but the running continues. The theory's most quietly devastating element is the relationship between the dream's content and what Homer would actually want to know about the real world outside the coma. His children are aging. Somewhere outside the dream, Bart is no longer 10. Lisa is no longer 8. Maggie has grown into whoever she grew into. Time has passed in the world that Homer can't access. The family that Homer is dreaming is a preservation of the family as it existed in April 1993, not the family as it exists in the present moment. The dream gives Homer everything except the thing that time gives people: growth, change, the arc of people's lives. He can have the dinner conversations, but not the conversations that would happen between a father and his adult children. He can have Marge as she was, but not Marge as she became over 30 years. The dream preserves what it has at the cost of everything that accumulation would have given him, and Homer's unconscious knows this. The moments in the show where Homer expresses genuine existential terror about time, about age, about his children growing up, about being left behind or forgotten, those moments are more frequent and more nakedly emotional than they would need to be in a straightforward comedy. The terror is real. The dreaming brain knows what it's missing, even if it can't access what's on the other side of the loss. The episode Lisa's Wedding shows a flash forward to Lisa as a young adult woman, engaged, living her life, having become the person the show always suggested she'd become. The episode is beautiful and melancholy in equal measure, and at the end of it, Lisa returns to being 8 years old. The flash forward is sealed. The dream resets. In the coma theory, the Lisa's Wedding episode is the dream briefly imagining what it cannot know. Homer's mind, starved of information about who his daughter grew into, constructed a version of her future based on the trajectory it had access to. The Lisa it imagined is the Lisa that Homer would have dreamed, articulate and principled and lonely and searching, exactly who the dream's version of 8-year-old Lisa would become if given time. And then the dream took it back, because it could not maintain the fiction of adult Lisa alongside the 8-year-old Lisa, who is the only Lisa Homer's memory actually holds. That episode, under the coma theory, is Homer's mind doing something extraordinarily tender. It gave Homer a glimpse of the daughter he's missing, and then it folded the glimpse back into the dream to protect the dreamer from knowing too precisely how much time has passed. Extended section: the full implications of the collective amnesia theory. And Springfield as America. The Tier S+ theory of Springfield's deliberate collective amnesia has been laid out in the main section, but its implications extend beyond Springfield into territory that is the show's most significant cultural contribution. The argument that Springfield isn't a portrait of a particular town but a diagnosis of a particular country. The show has depicted America's relationship with uncomfortable truth through the lens of Springfield for 36 years. And the portrait it paints is consistent regardless of which era you look at. The mechanism is always the same. Something happens that should permanently change things. The information is available. The evidence is visible. The truth is, at some level, known. And then the town chooses not to know it, chooses the version that allows the town to continue functioning without confronting what the truth would require. The three-eyed fish is the entry point. Blinky appears in Season 2, is acknowledged as evidence of contamination, becomes a brief news story within the show. Burns is forced to eat the fish to demonstrate it's harmless, and then the story disappears. Nobody follows up. Nobody tests the water. The fish exists in the show's continuity as an established fact, but the established fact has no downstream consequences. The town acknowledges it and then agrees to stop acknowledging it. This is a precise depiction of how American communities actually manage uncomfortable environmental truths. The evidence appears. The evidence is briefly discussed. The discussion reaches the edge of requiring action and then falls back. The people who would bear the greatest cost of acknowledgement, the people whose livelihoods depend on the industry producing the harm, have sufficient influence over the community to ensure that the discussion doesn't proceed past a certain point. The problem is noted and then effectively forgotten. The person who keeps pointing at it is treated as a troublemaker rather than an observer. The show has been depicting this cycle since its second season. In Springfield, it's Blinky and the nuclear plant. In America, it has been various versions of the same structure across different industries, different communities, different eras. The form is consistent. A harm is occurring. The harm is visible. The visibility is briefly acknowledged. The acknowledgement is contained. The harm continues. Springfield's collective amnesia is not a quirk of a fictional community. It's the show's most faithful piece of social observation, rendered in yellow-skinned cartoon form, and made funny enough that you can watch it for 36 years without it becoming unbearable. The Principal and the Pauper, the episode fans hate, is the episode that made the mechanism explicit. Before that episode, Springfield's forgetting happened in the gap between episodes, invisibly, as a structural feature of episodic storytelling that nobody was supposed to think too hard about. The Principal and the Pauper showed you the vote, showed you the decree, showed you the person being expelled for insisting on the truth, showed you the mechanism by which a community manages the cost of honesty by making honesty illegal. Fans found it uncomfortable because it wasn't funny in the way they expected the show to be funny. The mechanism was too visible. The show had been hiding it in the machinery of episodic conventions, and this episode dragged it into the light. The discomfort was the point. The fans who called it the worst episode were reacting to the show doing the thing that the theories in this ranking have been identifying for years, showing you the truth and then retreating before you can decide what to do with it. The America argument is the theory's final and most significant dimension. Springfield doesn't reflect America the way a satire reflects its target, from a critical distance that allows you to identify the subject being lampooned. Springfield has become America, or America has become Springfield. The relationship between the show's satirical portrait and the actual cultural conditions it was portraying has inverted over 36 years in a way that is genuinely strange to think about. In 1989, Springfield was a satirical exaggeration of American suburban life. The nuclear plant was a satirical exaggeration of American industrial negligence. Burns was a satirical exaggeration of American billionaire malevolence. The political corruption was a satirical exaggeration of American civic dysfunction. The collective amnesia was a satirical exaggeration of American short-term memory. In 2025, the satirical exaggerations don't look like exaggerations anymore. The gap between Springfield's nuclear plant and certain real American industrial facilities has narrowed. The gap between Burns and certain real American billionaires has narrowed. The gap between Springfield's media environment and certain real American media environments has narrowed. The gap between Springfield's political corruption and certain real American political conditions has narrowed. The show didn't predict any of this, in the sense of foreseeing specific events. It described the structural conditions that would produce these outcomes if they were allowed to develop without intervention. And they were allowed to develop. The satire described the trajectory. The trajectory continued. And now the caricature looks like a documentary. Springfield isn't more like America than it used to be, because America changed to resemble Springfield. America changed in ways that allowed the conditions Springfield was already satirizing to develop further. The show saw the structure. The structure continued. And the distance between the satirical portrait and the thing being portrayed closed. The loop in the floating timeline, the frozen ages, the perpetual present, is not just Springfield's trap, It is the trap of a culture that cannot allow its foundational myths to age, that keeps the family frozen on the couch, that insists on the permanence of things that should be allowed to change. The American family as archetype requires its fixed form. Homer must be middle class and employed. Marge must be patient and present. The children must be young. The loop is maintained because letting it break would require admitting something about what the American family actually is rather than what it's supposed to be. Springfield is the town where nobody looks at the cracked cooling towers and asks what they've been doing to the people below them for 30 years. America has its own version of those towers. Springfield's choice, the collective vote to maintain the lie, is not unique to a cartoon town in an unlocatable state. It is the operating system of any community that has more invested in its official narrative than in its actual conditions. The show has been saying this, dressed in jokes and couch gags and celebrity guest appearances and Homer falling downstairs, for 36 years. And most of us have watched it and laughed and gone back next week for more, which is exactly what Springfield does. Which is perhaps, in the end, the whole point. Section 5. Tier C+ Who Really Shot Mr. Burns? We're climbing now. The air gets thinner up here, or maybe just more interesting. The Tier C+ designation is for theories where the evidence is strong enough to take seriously, but where the official answer from the show creates a legitimate ceiling on how high the theory can rank. The most important example of this tier is the greatest mystery in the history of The Simpsons, and arguably the greatest mystery in the history of animated television. Who really shot Mr. Burns? Before you reach for the answer the show gave you, stay with the question for a moment. Because the show's answer, the canonical one, is surrounded by enough holes that the writers themselves created multiple alternate endings. One fan who apparently solved it correctly was never formally located, and at least one major character has since claimed the deed for himself on camera. Let's go back to the beginning properly, because the setup matters for understanding why the mystery still lives. Season 6, Episode 25. The summer of 1995, The Simpsons pulled off something no animated show had attempted before, and almost none have attempted since. A genuine, audience participation murder mystery, not a parody of one. An actual cliffhanger designed with enough real evidence planted across the episode that the show's creators genuinely believed viewers could solve it. Fox promoted it as a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a companion special. It was treated like a real unsolved case. The winner of the viewer contest would be animated into a future episode. Thousands upon thousands of entries were submitted. Nobody won. According to the DVD commentary for the two-part episode, not a single entry from the randomly selected sample correctly identified the shooter. The prize went to someone chosen at random who didn't have the right answer, and they received a cash payment instead of the promised animation appearance. The show's writers acknowledged they were aware of exactly one person who posted the correct answer online on the night of the original broadcast via a college internet account. By the time the producers went looking for that person, the account no longer existed. The one person who solved the mystery is still out there somewhere, their name lost to a defunct college internet server, never having collected their prize. Think about what that means for the integrity of the mystery as a puzzle. The show's creators designed it, told the public it was solvable, ran a national contest around it, and then when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody in the sample of entries had figured it out. Either the clues were genuinely insufficient, or the answer they chose didn't emerge naturally from the evidence. Now, let's look at what actually happened in the episode and why the official answer has problems. Burns was shot with his own gun. This is confirmed. His holster is shown empty before the shooting, meaning the shooter didn't bring a weapon to the town meeting. They used Burns's gun, which means either they took it from him during the encounter, or they found it on the ground after it was dropped. This detail is important because it narrows the pool of suspects. Anyone who came to that meeting already armed with their own weapon is, logically, slightly less likely to have been the shooter, because they already had a means of committing violence if they wanted to. The shooter was someone who acquired the means at the moment of the encounter. Burns fell against the town's sundial, and his hands landed on two letters. From the position of someone standing over him, those letters were W and S. From Burns's own perspective, lying with his head toward the sundial, the letters were M and S. The show presents this as the primary clue pointing to Maggie Simpson, M for Maggie, S for Simpson. Burns himself stated explicitly, on record within the episode that his hands landing on those letters was not deliberate. He fell. His hands went where they went. He was not attempting to communicate his attacker's identity through the positioning of his hands. The sundial clue, the centerpiece of the show's official solution, is explicitly described by the victim as meaningless. Burns said it was a coincidence. The show used it anyway. Burns's last words before being shot were, in the version it depicts through his testimony, he encountered Maggie in the parking lot, attempted to take her lollipop, and in the struggle his gun was displaced and picked up by Maggie, who then discharged it. Burns's earlier words before the shooting in the town meeting are rendered as confusion and hostility toward the assembled crowd. When he recognized his eventual attacker just before the shot, he allegedly said nothing memorable. But there is a version of events embedded in the episode's construction in which Burns, leaving the town meeting, encountered his shooter and said, in a tone of recognition rather than alarm, "Oh, it's you." He knew who it was. He wasn't surprised. He greeted them the way you greet someone you've interacted with before. Does that fit Maggie? Burns could barely remember Homer's name, and Homer worked for him for years. The idea that Burns would see a baby in a parking lot and say, "Oh, it's you," in a tone of familiarity is a stretch. The DNA evidence pointed to Homer. His fingerprints were on the gun. A Simpsons eyelash was found on Burns's suit. Homer had the clearest motive of any character in the episode, having reached what the show depicted as a genuine psychological breaking point over Burns's inability to remember his name. Homer was on the verge of being convicted when Burns woke up and redirected the investigation. Here's the question the show never asked. Why does Burns protect Homer? If the evidence points to Homer, if Homer had been on the verge of arrest and conviction, why does Burns wake up and immediately point away from the most evidence-supported suspect? Is it because Burns genuinely saw Maggie? Or is it because Burns, for reasons the show doesn't articulate, preferred the outcome where Homer was free and working at the plant? Burns's motivation to protect Homer is not explored, but consider the theory from the opposite direction. If Burns's continued operation of the plant depends on having an incompetent safety inspector who will never ask the right questions, then Homer's conviction and imprisonment would be catastrophic for Burns's long-term interests. A new safety inspector might actually inspect. Burns might therefore have a strong incentive to redirect blame onto the one class of suspect who could never face legal consequences: a baby. Chief Wiggum says it himself. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Maggie is the perfect fall person. She can't deny the accusation. She can't explain herself. She can't contradict the narrative. She will never be prosecuted, never be imprisoned, never even understand that she's been accused of something. If someone wanted to protect the real shooter and needed a placeholder, Maggie is ideal. The Marge theory deserves more attention than it usually gets. The case, advanced by a Reddit user and developed significantly since, runs as follows. Marge had watched Burns destroy the school funding, injure her family's dog, collapse the retirement home where her family members lived, and block out the sun over her entire town. She had watched her husband driven to the edge by years of being erased by his own employer. She is physically capable, was present at the town meeting, was depicted with visible anger throughout the episode, and had a relationship with Burns that was established in a prior episode where Burns became obsessed with her. The fact that Burns had been infatuated with Marge is the critical piece. If Burns was shot by Marge, his choice to protect her rather than name her becomes emotionally coherent. He loved her, or had loved her, or whatever the Burns equivalent of love is, and rather than destroy her, he let the sundial point where it would and let the town draw its own conclusions. This theory is not proven by the evidence, but it's not disproven by the evidence either. That's the honest assessment. Homer's Season 18 confession is usually treated as a throwaway line, and it probably is intended as one. But within the framework of the show's universe, a character stating on camera that they committed a specific act is not nothing. Homer says he was the one who shot Burns. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens anything. The show treats it as a joke. But if you're taking the mystery seriously, a confession is a confession. The alternate endings are themselves evidence of something. The Smithers ending was fully animated, fully voiced, and fully produced. It wasn't a rough storyboard. It was a finished piece of television. The script apparently also had a version involving Barney Gumble, which the writers considered seriously enough to develop before abandoning. This means the answer was not predetermined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers eventually chose. The mystery was reverse engineered. The evidence was made to point at Maggie because Maggie was the final answer, not because Maggie was the answer the clues naturally pointed to. The 138th episode Spectacular, the clip show that revealed the Smithers alternate ending, included a line from Troy McClure dismissing that ending because all the Simpson DNA evidence would have to be ignored, which would be downright nutty. This line is widely understood as a reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, which was happening simultaneously with the broadcast of the mystery. A jury had just demonstrated in real life that DNA evidence could be set aside. The show was winking. It was telling you that the official answer isn't necessarily the right answer. It was telling you that the evidence can be made to point wherever the people with authority want it to point. That's not a subtle message. That's the show embedded a commentary about the malleability of evidence into its own fictional murder mystery. The reason this theory is tier C+ rather than higher is that the show has an official canonical answer, and the canonical answer is what it is. Maggie shot Mr. Burns. The show committed to it. Burns identified her. The narrative closed. The theory lives in the space between what the show officially established and what the evidence actually supports, and that space is real and significant. But it can't push the theory to tier B because the canon is what it is, tier C+. The mystery is still open. The town just decided it wasn't. Section 6, Tier B, the Maggie theory. Maggie is the most capable and potentially most dangerous person in Springfield. Tier B is where we start finding theories that the show has clearly endorsed through its own storytelling, even if it has never explicitly stated them as fact. These are theories that the evidence demands you take seriously. The first Tier B entry is the Maggie theory, and if you've spent time in Simpsons fan spaces, you've encountered versions of it. But the full version, assembled properly from all the available evidence, is more striking than any single piece of it suggests. Maggie Simpson doesn't talk. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She communicates through pacifier movement, facial expression, and the occasional deliberate gesture. She is physically limited to infant motor skills. She falls when she tries to walk. She can't form words or sentences in any sustained way. And in that physical and linguistic limitation, without the ability to announce herself or explain herself or make claims about her own capability, she has accomplished a specific set of things that deserve to be listed carefully. She shot the richest and most powerful man in Springfield with his own gun at point-blank range. Whether or not she intended to pull the trigger, the event happened and she was physically capable of executing it. In the theatrical short film The Longest Daycare, nominated for an Academy Award in 2013, Maggie is dropped at a daycare center and spends 7 minutes executing a multi-step plan to protect a caterpillar from a bully child, navigating a facility designed to contain and monitor infants, improvising solutions to obstacles she couldn't have anticipated, and succeeding completely. The film contains no dialogue from Maggie. Everything she accomplishes through observation, planning, and adaptive problem-solving. Her decision-making throughout is flawless. Every choice she makes is the correct choice. She has led collective action among infants at a daycare facility against a tyrannical caretaker, coordinating a group of children who cannot communicate in language, achieving outcomes that required them to act in sequence toward a shared goal. She has been tested for intelligence, and the results, while varying across episodes, consistently point toward the upper extreme of what can be measured. She saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations across different episodes. She demonstrated, in the final shot of the Burns shooting episode, that she is aware of what she did, aware of its significance, and aware that demonstrating this awareness in front of others would have consequences. She waited until the room was empty. She checked her surroundings. Then she reenacted the shooting gesture with her pacifier. That sequence requires situational awareness, memory, and the recognition that some information is worth keeping to yourself. These are not traits associated with infants. The theory that Maggie's silence is a conscious strategic choice, rather than developmental delay, is supported by everything listed above and by one additional observation. Look at what happened to the last person in this family who was visibly, openly intelligent. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. Her intelligence is established unambiguously. She is one of the most academically gifted characters in the show's history, and her intelligence has cost her. She is socially isolated. She is dismissed by adults who should be encouraging her. She has been mocked, excluded, and condescended to by a community that consistently rewards Homer's variety of energetic incompetence over her variety of thoughtful excellence. Lisa fights every day to be heard, and most days, she isn't. Maggie has watched this happen since she was born. She has observed from the beginning of her conscious life exactly what visibility costs an intelligent female member of this family. And she has drawn a different conclusion than Lisa drew. Lisa's conclusion was to keep fighting. Maggie's conclusion was to make herself undetectable. Every heroic act Maggie has ever performed, every display of exceptional capability, every moment where she has solved something that adults couldn't solve, she has performed in circumstances where nobody was paying close attention. She saved her family while everyone was focused elsewhere. She led the daycare rebellion in a facility where nobody was monitoring infants carefully enough to notice them organizing. The Burns shooting happened in a parking lot with no witnesses who mattered. The pattern is consistent across more than 3 decades of storytelling. Maggie's effectiveness is proportional to her invisibility. The radiation theory adds a dimension here. If Springfield's nuclear contamination creates mutations that affect different individuals differently, if the environmental exposure that reduced Homer's intelligence to clinical disability range simultaneously produced different effects in other family members, then Maggie represents the opposite pole from Homer. The same source, the same water, the same irradiated air. Homer's brain was diminished. Maggie's was amplified. Same contaminated environment, same family, dramatically different results, which is consistent with how radiation actually affects biological systems. Exposure creates variance rather than uniformity. It amplifies differences rather than smoothing them. The emotional reading of the Maggie theory, particularly in the context of the coma theory we'll get to later, is devastating in a quiet way. If Homer is in a coma, if he's been unconscious since April 1993, and the entire show is the product of his dreaming mind, then Maggie's genius is not a mutation at all. It's a father's deepest hope for his youngest child, projected into the dream because he can't see her grow up. He can't watch her develop. He can't hear her speak or know what kind of person she becomes. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her limitations. He makes her capable of everything she would need to be capable of in order to survive without him. In that reading, Maggie's genius isn't evidence of radiation. It's evidence of love. Both readings are valid within their respective frameworks. The beauty of the Maggie theory is that it integrates naturally into every other major theory about Springfield, which is one of the qualities that makes a theory worth ranking highly. What keeps this at Tier B rather than Tier A is that the show has never formally committed to the idea that Maggie's silence is strategic, rather than simply a long-running comedic device about the baby who doesn't talk. The evidence for strategic intelligence is overwhelming. The evidence for the specific interpretation that this intelligence is self-concealing is inferential. The pattern is there. The intentionality behind the pattern is not confirmed, but the pattern is strong enough that inferential isn't dismissive. Tier B. Maggie is watching all of us, and she has been watching for a long time. Section 7. Tier B plus Mr. Burns's impossible lifespan. Charles Montgomery Burns is the oldest man in Springfield. He is almost certainly the oldest character in animated television history who isn't explicitly supernatural. The show has placed his birth somewhere in the late 1800s across various episodes, which by any version of the timeline makes him somewhere between 110 and 140 years old at the time of the most recent seasons. He does not simply exist at this age. He functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with enough operational complexity to require constant management. He manipulates municipal politics with sustained strategic sophistication. He has personal relationships, plans long-term, remembers decades of personal history with clarity, and maintains a working understanding of modern technology and finance adequate to remain competitive. His body is frail. He has almost no physical strength, but his mind, for whatever category of being Burns qualifies as, is sharp. The show addresses his survival mechanism directly in the Season 8 episode, The Springfield Files, which we'll discuss more fully later. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so chemically and radiologically extreme, that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment sustains him for exactly 1 more week. Without the next dose, he dies. The margin for error is 0. This is not a throwaway detail. Think about what it establishes within the show's logic. Burns is not surviving through natural biological processes. He is being maintained artificially, on a precise recurring schedule, through medical interventions that the show describes explicitly as involving radiation. A man who owns a nuclear power plant, who has been managing the effects of radioactive exposure on a living organism for longer than most people have been alive, is keeping himself alive through the controlled application of the same force he uses to generate electricity and poison his neighbor's water supply. His immune system presents separately. In one of the most quoted scenes in the series, Burns visits a doctor who informs him that he has every disease known to medicine simultaneously, every single one. The doctor explains that the diseases exist in his body in a state of perfect equilibrium, each one preventing the others from progressing, creating a biological gridlock that renders Burns technically indestructible despite being catastrophically ill. Three Stooges syndrome, the doctor calls it. 3 people trying to fit through a doorway at once, none of them can get through. Under the radiation theory, this isn't comedy. It's the logical outcome of a century of managed exposure. Burns's weekly treatments don't cure his diseases. They regulate them. They keep every illness in the precise stasis required to prevent any single condition from achieving dominance. His body is not a biological system anymore. It is a managed environment. His bloodstream is a chemical ecosystem that requires constant calibration. Remove the treatment, and the calibration collapses. Every disease that has been balanced against every other disease surges forward simultaneously. Burns is not alive in the way that other people are alive. He is maintained. There is a difference. Waylon Smithers' role in this system is worth examining separately because it changes the nature of their entire relationship. The show depicts Smithers as devoted to Burns in a way that codes as romantic or quasi-romantic, and that reading is probably intentional. But there's another layer that the show suggests without stating. Smithers isn't just emotionally devoted. He's functionally essential. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Smithers ensures Burns makes every weekly medical appointment. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with an attentiveness that borders on the clinical. The show has established repeatedly that Burns is helpless without Smithers, not in the comic exaggeration sense where a wealthy person is helpless without their assistant, but in a more specific sense. If Smithers left, Burns would miss a treatment. Burns would die. Smithers knows this. Burns presumably knows this. Their relationship is not simply employer and devoted employee. It is, at a structural level, the relationship between a machine and the person who maintains it. Smithers' devotion is inseparable from his knowledge that he is the only thing standing between Burns and a very quick death. Whether that knowledge is the cause of his devotion or simply coexists with it, it means that their bond has a weight to it that goes beyond what the show's surface comedy acknowledges. Burns's historical connections extend the immortality question into territory the show never fully examines. Burns has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described working relationships with historical figures who died before living memory. He attended Yale. He served in World War II in a capacity the show makes clear was morally complex at best. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during that war and kept it hidden for decades. He knew Howard Hughes. He has described the Gilded Age not as history but as something he lived through. The show occasionally hints that the Burns family's capacity for extended life might not begin with Charles Montgomery. The Burns dynasty is depicted as one of the oldest and most consistently powerful lineages in American history. They were already wealthy, beyond accountability when the nation was young. That kind of multi-generational continuity, that kind of sustained dominance across centuries, is unusual even for old money. Most dynasties decay within a few generations. The Burns family has not decayed. Either they have been extraordinarily lucky or they have found ways across generations to maintain their hold on power that go beyond conventional inheritance. The show doesn't say they've been achieving extended lifespans across multiple generations, but it doesn't say they haven't. And the question hangs in the air of every episode where Burns makes an offhand reference to something that happened in 1887. The scariest dimension of the Burns immortality theory is the economic one. Springfield needs Burns, not as a narrative convenience. Within the show's logic, Springfield's economy is dependent on the power plant. The power plant requires Burns's continued ownership and management to function at its current scale. Burns requires his medical treatments. His medical treatments require the infrastructure that his wealth provides. The loop is closed. Springfield cannot kill Burns because killing Burns would mean the power plant would pass to someone who might fix it, which would mean acknowledging what it had been doing unfixed for decades. Springfield cannot even hold Burns accountable, because Burns's absence from the town's economic structure would be destabilizing in ways the town isn't equipped to manage. The corruption at the center of Springfield is also the engine that keeps Springfield running. This is not an accident. Burns is too expensive to die. Springfield will keep paying whatever price his survival requires for as long as his treatment schedule holds. Tier B+. The evidence for Burns's artificial immortality is strong and canonical. The full implications of that immortality, the nature of his relationship with Smithers, the possible multi-generational quality of the Burns family's longevity practices, remain inference-heavy enough to stay out of the Tier A range. Section 8, Tier A, The Mona Simpson Conspiracy. 3 generations of Simpsons broken by one man's grudge. This is Tier A territory. The evidence is near ironclad. What we're about to discuss is not fan theory in the speculative sense. It is the show's own stated narrative, assembled from multiple episodes, traced across 3 generations of the same family, and examined for what it actually reveals about the architecture of Homer Simpson's damage. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson had told Homer this when Homer was young. There was a grave. Homer mourned, grew up, and built an adult life around the grief of maternal loss. His personality across all those early seasons is rooted in a specific kind of emotional hunger, the desperate need for approval, the terror of abandonment, the willingness to endure humiliation and degradation from authority rather than risk losing whatever stability he has. Homer Simpson's defining character traits are not random. They are the profile of a person shaped by profound early loss. The episode Mother Simpson, Season 7, Episode 8, aired the 19th of November, 1995, and it is widely considered one of the greatest episodes in the show's history. It begins as a comedy about Homer faking his own death to avoid work, and becomes something else entirely when Homer, going to the Hall of Records to correct the administrative error created by his fake death, discovers that his mother is alive. The grave Abe showed him belonged to Walt Whitman, a different grave for a famous person who had nothing to do with the Simpson family. Abe had been pointing to a poet's headstone and calling it his wife's for the entirety of Homer's life. The reunion between Homer and Mona at the cemetery is genuinely affecting. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona tells him why she left. She didn't die. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she had no other choice. Because staying would have endangered Homer and Abe. Because the man whose name was already attached to Homer's future had destroyed her life and forced her underground. The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife. She joined a group of activists who were organizing around the causes that defined that era. And then they targeted something specific, a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let that settle for a moment. Not a nuclear power plant. A germ warfare facility. Burns was manufacturing biological weapons in the same town where Homer was growing up, in Springfield, among people who had no idea what was being produced down the road. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agent inside the facility. During the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the security guard, a young Clancy Wiggum, who would later become Springfield's chief of police. The raid was successful. The weapons were destroyed, but Mona made one mistake. Fleeing the facility, she stopped to help someone who had fallen in the chaos. That someone was Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and he saw her face. He reported her to the FBI. From that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a federal fugitive. She couldn't go home. She couldn't contact her family. She couldn't hold her son or explain to him why she was leaving. She kissed Homer while he was sleeping and disappeared. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. He was told she was dead. He spent the next 3 decades believing he was the kind of son a mother would rather disappear than raise. Now here is where the conspiracy element enters, because this isn't simply a sad story about a woman who had to leave. Burns didn't just identify Mona to the FBI in 1969 and move on. He pursued her, actively, personally, for decades. Burns held a grudge against a woman who destroyed his weapons laboratory, and he used the full weight of his resources and connections to ensure she could never return to Springfield. When Mona finally came back in season 7, Burns recognized her through a cab window and called the authorities immediately. The FBI arrived at the Simpson house. Mona had to run again. Homer had to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. And he still works for Burns. Homer works for the man who stole his mother. He earns his paycheck from the person who is directly responsible for the defining wound of his life. He walks through the gates of the Springfield nuclear power plant every morning and into the employ of the single human being most responsible for his emotional damage. And he doesn't connect the dots. The show acknowledges this is not a joke. It plays the moment where Homer recognizes the connection, the moment where the shape of his suffering becomes briefly visible to him as tragedy. Because Homer isn't capable of sustaining that recognition. His brain doesn't work that way. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of cognitive erosion from living in Springfield's contaminated environment, these things have damaged the part of Homer's mind that makes connections. He sees the dots. He can't draw the line between them. But the conspiracy doesn't stop with Mona. The show later established that Burns and Abe Simpson struck a deal. Burns had committed a crime that Abe discovered. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed Homer a job at the plant, permanently and without condition, regardless of performance, regardless of incidents, regardless of the 742 documented errors. The deal protected Homer from the consequences of his own incompetence. Homer's job security, which the show had always treated as a comfortable running gag, turned out to be a contractual obligation between a grieving grandfather and the man who had destroyed the family. This means Abe knew. Abe knew what Burns had done to Mona. He knew who had destroyed his family. He made a deal with that person anyway and kept it secret for the rest of his life. And Homer's. The grave with Walt Whitman's name on it. The years of Homer believing his mother was dead. The shaping of Homer's personality around a loss that didn't have to happen. All of it happened with Abe's knowledge and Abe's silence. 3 generations of Simpsons broken by one man's grudge. Mona lost her family and spent the rest of her life as a fugitive. Abe lost his wife and spent the rest of his life keeping the reason why to himself. Homer inherited a shape of damage he would never fully understand, became cognitively impaired, in ways the show traces back to environmental exposure and possible deliberate neglect by a medical establishment. Burns may have influenced, and spent his entire adult life working for the architect of his suffering. And Burns won. He always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the money doesn't just write the rules. He writes the history. He decides what people know. He decides what people believe. He turned Mona into a ghost and Homer into a man who would never ask why everything in his life felt so heavy, and he did it without Homer ever knowing enough to resist. The episode in which Mona eventually dies is one of the show's quietest and most devastating pieces of work. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew slip away for the last time. No cutaway, no reset, no joke. Just a man and his mother and 27 years of stolen time. The reason this theory earns Tier A rather than Tier S is that while the evidence is canonical and explicit, the full conspiracy reading, the argument that Burns engineered Homer's emotional damage deliberately as a way of producing an ideal employee, requires an inference that goes beyond what the show directly states. The show shows you the pieces. It doesn't assemble them on screen. You have to do that yourself. And the assembly is compelling, but it's still your assembly. Tier A. 3 generations of damage from one man's power. The show put it all on screen, one piece at a time. There are 2 more elements of the Mona theory that deserve their own space because they expand the conspiracy beyond just the Simpson family and into something broader about how Burns operates in Springfield. The first concerns the biological weapons laboratory itself. The show mentions it once, in Mother Simpson, and never returns to it. The lab was real, it was in Springfield. It was producing weapons-grade pathogens while children played nearby, while families lived their ordinary lives, while the town of Springfield conducted the ordinary business of a small American city. And then it was destroyed, and nobody in Springfield ever discussed it again, and Burns's involvement in biological weapons development apparently had no regulatory, legal, or civic consequences. This connects to the broader pattern that the show depicts across many episodes, that Burns operates in Springfield with an effective immunity from accountability that goes far beyond what even significant wealth normally provides. He is not simply rich enough to buy political protection, though he is certainly that. He is structurally protected by Springfield's own inability to confront what it knows. The biological weapons lab is the most extreme example of this. A private citizen was manufacturing weapons in a residential area. The FBI was called, not to investigate Burns, but to hunt down the woman who destroyed the weapons. The law was deployed in defense of the wrongdoer and against the person who stopped the wrongdoing. And the town moved on. The second element worth dwelling on is the nature of Mona's activism itself. She's not depicted as a bomb thrower or an extremist in the show's actual rendering of her character. She's depicted as a woman of genuine conviction who made a calculation that destroying those weapons was worth the consequences. The show treats her with enormous sympathy. Her cause is portrayed as legitimate. The thing she destroyed was genuinely wrong. And her punishment, 27 years as a federal fugitive, separated from her son, was wildly disproportionate to what she did. The show is not subtle about this. It is telling you, in the episode Mother Simpson, that the system punished the right person and protected the wrong one. That is a specific and intentional statement embedded in one of the show's most celebrated episodes, and it sits at the center of everything strange and dark about Springfield's institutional structure. Tier A. Held firmly. Section 9. Tier A. The Homer Coma Theory. We need to talk about the 1st of April 1993. Season 4, Episode 18. The episode is called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise, on the surface, is simple. Bart plays a series of escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer, culminating in taking one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker. When Homer opens the can, the explosion sends him to the hospital. While Homer lies in his hospital bed recovering, he reaches for a candy bar from a vending machine across the room. The machine tips forward. It lands on him, and Homer Simpson enters a genuine clinical coma. This is not presented as a dream sequence or a fantasy. The coma is depicted as real, medical, and serious. The family gathers at the bedside. Bart is racked with guilt. The situation has genuine stakes. The episode ends with Homer apparently waking up. Bart tearfully confesses at the bedside. Homer springs awake and immediately strangles his son. The family laughs. Everything returns to normal. The show tells you he woke up. But in the final moments of that same episode, the show also tells you that Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5%, permanently destroyed, never recoverable. And Homer's response to learning that he is permanently brain damaged is to laugh, even though he says in the moment that he doesn't know why he's laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends, and 32 more years of The Simpsons continue as if nothing significant happened. Unless nothing did happen. Unless Homer never woke up. This is the Homer coma theory, and it is the single most popular, most debated, and most internally consistent fan theory in the history of the show. The essential argument, originally articulated in a Reddit post, is this. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. Every single episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every celebrity appearance, every impossible event, is a dream generated by the comatose mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits beside him and waits. The evidence is arranged in layers, and each layer reinforces the others. Layer 1. The tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a recognizably grounded show. Not realistic in a photographic sense, it was always a cartoon, but its storylines dealt with recognizable human problems rendered through satirical exaggeration. Homer tries to quit drinking. Marge considers the nature of her marriage and whether it's what she wants. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher who represents the kind of intellectual mentorship she can't find at home. Bart struggles academically and faces real academic consequences. These are family problems. They're scaled up and made funny, but they're rooted in the kind of situations that people actually experience. Financial anxiety, marital tension, academic struggle. The desire to be seen as more than what your circumstances say you are. After the coma episode, everything changes. The shift is not subtle. Homer goes to space. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer joins a secret society. Homer's mother is revealed to be a radical fugitive. Homer meets God twice. Homer travels internationally dozens of times, holds hundreds of different jobs, befriends a seemingly unlimited number of celebrities, and survives physical trauma that would kill a military unit. The escalation is so dramatic and so consistent that even casual viewers who don't know the theory have noticed the shift. The internet has been debating when The Simpsons got bad for more than 20 years. The coma theory offers a precise answer. The show didn't get bad. Homer's brain got worse. A deteriorating brain dreaming increasingly fantastical content is exactly what you would expect from a coma patient's mind as the weeks become months become years. Early in the coma, the dream might resemble life closely. The Simpsons of 1989 through early 1993 is that relatively grounded show. As the coma extends, as the brain suffers more damage, the dream content becomes more unstable, more grandiose, more disconnected from plausible reality. Homer in space. Homer meeting God. Homer as the leader of a secret organization. The dreams of a man whose brain is losing its grip on what life actually looked like. Layer 2. The Divine Warning. 6 months before the coma episode. In the Season 4 premiere Homer the Heretic, Homer has a conversation with God. An actual, face-to-face, theologically significant conversation. And during that conversation, God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. God says Homer's time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The coma theory reads this as prophecy. God was telling Homer that his waking life was drawing toward its end. 6 months later, the vending machine falls. The waking life ends. Everything that follows is the dream. The show presents this conversation as a charming theological joke. The coma theory presents it as the moment Homer was given notice of what was coming. Layer 3. The aging problem. This is the most elegant piece of the coma theory's evidence because it solves something that no other explanation handles as gracefully. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old since 1989. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge are frozen in middle age. The show uses a floating timeline mechanism that keeps the present perpetually current while the characters remain static, and most people accept this as a structural quirk of long-running animation. The coma theory offers the simplest possible explanation. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen memory of an unconscious man. Homer went into the coma in April 1993. His children were 10, 8, and 1 year old. His wife looked exactly like she looked that day. His friends were the ages they were when the vending machine fell. His dreaming mind cannot imagine them growing up because he wasn't there to see it happen. His children stay the ages they were because those are the only ages his frozen memory has access to. In this reading, the floating timeline is not a production convenience. It is the literal structure of a dream. Dreams preserve their subjects at the last moment the dreamer experienced them. Time moves in the waking world. But in the dream, the subjects are held at the moment of last contact. Homer's family is preserved in amber because his memory of them stopped accumulating on the day he went under. Layer 4. The Celebrity Problem. Later seasons of The Simpsons are saturated with celebrity guest appearances in a way that early seasons are not. The escalation roughly tracks with the post-coma timeline. The coma theory explains this by suggesting that Homer's unconscious mind is absorbing ambient stimuli from the hospital room. Voices from television sets. Conversations at the bedside. Sounds drifting through the door. His dreaming brain receives fragments of names, voices, cultural references, and incorporates them into the dream as characters. The celebrities who appear in Springfield aren't people who happen to visit Springfield. Their voices Homer heard through the fog of unconsciousness, translated by a dreaming brain into familiar faces in a familiar world. Layer 5. The show's own acknowledgement. In season 34, the episode Lisa the Boy Scout included a deliberately leaked, fake deleted scene in which Homer wakes from a long coma and the audience understands that every outlandish episode was a dream. The show's writers created this scene as a direct reference to the fan theory. They animated it, they showed it to the audience, and then the show said it was a hoax, a scene planted by hackers, not a real part of the episode, but they made it at all. They wrote it, animated it, voiced it, and released it. The writers know about the theory. They engaged with it seriously enough to produce content addressing it directly. Their denial came wrapped inside an episode that literally depicted Homer waking from a coma. They showed you the resolution and then told you it wasn't real. Al Jean, the executive producer, addressed the theory directly in 2015 and dismissed it as fan speculation. But his dismissal was limited. He said it isn't true. He didn't explain why nobody ages. He didn't address the tonal shift after season 4. He didn't explain the divine warning 6 months before the coma. He didn't account for the progressive surrealism that tracks precisely with what you'd expect from a dreaming brain under increasing neurological stress. He said it's not true and moved on. The theory doesn't require his endorsement. Now, the emotionally devastating part. The coma theory, if you accept it, transforms the entire emotional register of The Simpsons. Every episode becomes not comedy, but tragedy, of a very specific and very quiet kind. The dream is not a nightmare. It's not a horror show. It's the most wish-fulfillment-rich environment Homer's mind could construct given its resources. Because Homer's deepest wish is not complicated. He wants his family. He wants Marge to still love him, in the way she loved him in 1993, which is the last version of that love he has access to. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous little boy of 10, which is the only version of Bart his memory can reach. He wants Lisa to still be playing saxophone in her bedroom, still 8 years old, still young enough to need him. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold. He wants the house on Evergreen Terrace to exist as it existed on the day he went under, warm and imperfect and full of the specific noise of his specific family. And in the coma, the dream gives him everything he wants. All of it, frozen at the moment of greatest accessibility. His children never grow up, never move away, never become adults who have lives of their own and gradually need him less. His wife never leaves. The house is always there. The beer is always cold. Friday nights in Springfield go on forever. Homer's coma is not a tragedy in the way that physical suffering is tragic. It is a tragedy in the way that love is tragic. The way that wanting to hold something in place long after time has moved it on is tragic. The dream is not a cage. The dream is the only form of heaven that Homer Simpson's mind would construct if given unlimited resources and no external constraints. A house on Evergreen Terrace where everything is always as it was. The reason this theory sits at tier A and not tier S is that the show, while having produced enormous circumstantial support for it, has never incorporated it canonically. The acknowledgement in season 34 was followed by explicit denial. The tonal evidence, the divine warning, the celebrity influx, the aging freeze, all of these are supportive without being definitive. The theory explains everything elegantly, but the explanation requires you to override the show's stated position on whether Homer woke up. The evidence is overwhelming. The canonical position is in the way, hence Tier A rather than Tier S. Tier A. Homer has been dreaming since April 1993, and every episode since has been a love letter from an unconscious father to the family he can't reach. There is a dimension of the coma theory that deserves its own paragraph because it's the dimension most people don't think through when they first encounter the theory. If Homer is dreaming, and if the dream is being generated by a brain that is slowly losing function over 32 years, then the quality of the dream should be degrading. And it is. The increasingly bizarre, consequence-free, logic-resistant quality of later Simpsons seasons is exactly consistent with a dreaming mind whose substrate is deteriorating. The early dream, 1993 through roughly 1997, is relatively coherent. The plots follow logical progressions, the characters behave consistently. The world of the dream holds its shape. As the seasons progress, as the dreaming brain accumulates more damage, the dream becomes harder to maintain. Characters contradict their own histories. Events from previous episodes are forgotten within the dream itself. The plots become more fantastical. The celebrity appearances multiply. Reality becomes increasingly negotiable. This is not a random quality change in a TV show that ran too long. Within the coma theory's framework, it is the precise pattern you would expect from a man whose brain is losing its ability to sustain coherent simulation. The dream isn't getting worse because the writers got lazy. The dream is getting stranger because Homer is getting sicker. And somewhere, in a hospital bed in Springfield General, his family is still sitting beside him, and the numbers on the monitors are still moving, and the dream continues to run, and every Sunday at 8 o'clock the television shows you another night in the life of a man who has been asleep for 32 years. Section 10. Tier S. The Springfield nuclear power plant is mutating the entire town. Here we are, the top tier. The S designation is for theories where the evidence isn't circumstantial. It isn't inferential. It isn't pattern recognition applied to ambiguous material. The S designation is for theories where the show has essentially been telling you the answer for 36 years, and the only reason it hasn't registered as the answer is that the show presents it within a comic register that keeps you from processing it as seriously as the content deserves. The theory that the Springfield nuclear power plant is actively mutating the town's population is not a fan theory in the speculative sense. It is a close reading of what the show has explicitly depicted, episode after episode, across its entire run. The mutations are canon. The contamination is canon. The cover-up is canon. The cognitive damage is canon. The show put all of this on screen. It just did it through Homer falling asleep and through Mr. Burns being cartoonishly evil. And we laughed and moved on. Let's slow down and actually look at what the show has told us. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility owned by Charles Montgomery Burns. It is the primary power source for the entire town. By any reasonable standard of measurement, it is one of the most dangerous industrial facilities in the history of fiction, and the show establishes this not through implication but through specific canonical detail. A surprise safety inspection found 342 violations. 342. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to code was $56 million. Burns refused to pay it, not because the money was unavailable. Burns is a billionaire many times over, but because fixing the violations would mean acknowledging that they existed. And acknowledging their existence would invite questions about what those violations had already done to the people living downwind. The violations themselves are not minor bureaucratic technicalities. The show specifies them. Radioactive waste dumped directly into bodies of water. Radioactive waste deposited on children's playgrounds. Plutonium being used as a paperweight. Cracked cooling towers patched with chewing gum. Luminous rats in the facility's lower levels. And human skeletons in the basement, shown and never explained. The show presents those bones in the background of a scene and does not revisit them. Nobody asks who those people were. Nobody asks how they ended up dead inside an operating reactor. The bones are just there. The safety inspector responsible for preventing all of this is Homer Simpson. Homer's qualifications for this role have been described explicitly in the show. The creator Matt Groening has stated in interviews that Homer has an IQ of 55. An episode in Season 12 establishes that Homer once had a crayon removed from his brain, where it had been lodged since childhood, and that the removal temporarily elevated his IQ to genius level. Before the crayon was removed, Homer had been operating with a foreign object, physically reducing his cognitive function his entire adult life. After the crayon was replaced, at Homer's own request, he returned to his previous level of functioning. A man with the cognitive profile of someone with a crayon in their brain has been the primary safety inspector at a nuclear facility with 342 unaddressed violations for more than 3 decades. He has slept at his workstation. He has eaten donuts during meltdown warnings. He once caused a nuclear incident by throwing food into the reactor core out of curiosity. He is the single point of failure between Springfield and the catastrophe the show has been gesturing towards since the beginning. The mutations are where the theory's evidence reaches its strongest point. The first visible mutant appeared in Season 2. Blinky, the three-eyed fish, pulled from a river near the power plant. Blinky became a local news story within the show. A gubernatorial candidate used Blinky as campaign evidence that Burns was poisoning the environment. Burns was forced to eat the fish on live television to prove it was harmless. The town watched, and then everyone moved on. Nobody tested the water, nobody conducted follow-up studies. Nobody asked the obvious question about what was happening to the people drinking the same water that produced a three-eyed fish. The show answered that question in Season 8, in the Springfield Files, without appearing to answer it. Homer sees what he believes is an alien in the woods near Springfield. The entire town panics. FBI agents Mulder and Scully are brought in. The episode builds to a dramatic reveal. The alien is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns, emerging from his weekly medical treatment in a state of dazed euphoria, his body so saturated with radiation therapy that it emits a visible green glow. Burns walks through the woods after each treatment glowing. His body produces light. That is what the treatments have done to his cellular biology. The people of Springfield see this glowing figure, and their first interpretation is that it must be an extraterrestrial, not radiation, not the nuclear plant on their skyline, an alien. Consider what that response reveals about the depth of the town's denial. The most likely explanation for a glowing humanoid figure in the woods of a town dominated by a nuclear plant isn't even on the table. The cognitive pathways that would generate that obvious connection have been, in some meaningful sense, degraded. Now look at the residents themselves. Homer's physical characteristics, significant overbite, eyes that appear to protrude beyond anatomically normal parameters, 4 fingers on each hand, a skull shape inconsistent with standard human craniofacial geometry, an IQ in the clinical disability range, a body that absorbs physical trauma that would be fatal to normal humans routinely and repeatedly and recovers without any residual effect. He has been shot, electrocuted, fallen from heights, been struck by vehicles, survived explosions. His healing rate is extraordinary. His pain tolerance is inhuman. His physical resilience is categorically different from what any unaltered human biology would produce. Marge has the same protruding eyes, the same 4-fingered hands, and hair that grows vertically against gravity in a tower that defies physical explanation and has maintained its exact shape for 36 years without apparent effort. Marge was employed at the nuclear plant herself. She was exposed directly to the same facility, the same violations, the same leaking radiation that Homer has been marinating in for decades. Their children were conceived and born after both parents had been living in Springfield's contaminated environment for years. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie all display physical characteristics that do not occur in normal human populations. Spiky hair that maintains geometric precision without product, overbites, the eyes, and the yellow skin that covers every resident of Springfield and no one else. That last detail is the one that should have been the smoking gun decades ago. Every person who lives in Springfield has yellow skin. Nobody from outside Springfield has yellow skin. When guest characters arrive in Springfield, when celebrities visit, when people come from other towns and other states, they look different. Their proportions are more naturalistic. Their skin color falls within the range of human variation. Their features more closely resemble human anatomy as it actually presents. The show explains this as art style. The Simpsons looks the way it looks. That's just how it is. But within the logic of the show's own universe, within the world the show has constructed in which these characters are real people living real lives, there is a visible, observable, consistent difference between people who live in Springfield and people who don't. The people inside the contamination zone look like what decades of radiation exposure would produce in a population. The people outside it look like normal humans. The animals confirm it. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same protruding eyes as his owners. Blinky grew a third eye from the same river that provides Springfield's water. Springfield's wildlife is demonstrably mutated by the power plant's runoff, and the show says this explicitly when it shows you Blinky and tells you that this fish grew a third eye from radiation exposure. It then expects you to believe that the same radiation has had zero effect on the humans living in the same environment, drinking the same water, breathing the same air. It doesn't expect you to believe that, actually. It's been telling you the opposite for 36 years. It just told you with comedy instead of drama. The most chilling piece of evidence in the entire theory is the one that brings everything together. In the Simpsons movie, the EPA, a real federal regulatory agency operating within the show's universe, determines that Springfield's environmental contamination has reached a point so severe that the entire town must be sealed under a massive glass dome to prevent its pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. The United States federal government, the EPA, looked at Springfield and concluded that the appropriate response was physical containment. Think about what that means. The federal government of the United States, within this show's logic, examined Springfield and categorized the entire town as an environmental hazard, a contamination zone, too dangerous to remain in contact with the surrounding environment. The town is sealed. The people inside it, every resident who has been drinking the water and breathing the air for decades, are still inside when the dome goes up. Burns knows. He has always known. The show makes this unambiguous across multiple episodes. Burns has private physicians. He undergoes treatments specifically designed to manage the effects of radiation on his own body. He has pharmaceutical infrastructure capable of producing experimental therapies. He understands radiation biology at a level that nobody else in Springfield approaches, because his own survival depends on managing radiation's effects in his own body in real time. He knows what radiation does to biological systems. He knows what his plant is doing to Springfield. He has known for decades. The choice to keep Homer as safety inspector isn't negligence. When German investors briefly purchased the plant in one episode, the first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was calculate the cost of bringing the facility up to code and nearly collapsed financially from the estimate alone. Burns bought the plant back and rehired Homer. A competent safety inspector would have the plant shut down within a week. Homer ensures the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. And Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, its economy, and by extension its population, a population whose capacity for critical thinking has been progressively compromised by decades of neurological exposure. The crayon in Homer's brain is the theory's most potent single piece of evidence. When the crayon is removed in season 12, Homer becomes intelligent, articulate, and capable of seeing Springfield clearly for the first time. And what he sees is unbearable. He sees his job for what it is. He sees his life for what it is. He sees the town clearly, and he can't live with the clarity. He has the crayon reinserted. He chooses the fog. But the theory asks a question the show never addresses. How did a crayon get lodged in a child's brain without anyone noticing? Homer went through his entire childhood, his adolescence, his entire adult life, visiting doctors in Springfield, receiving checkups at medical facilities in a town that Burns essentially owns. Not one physician, across decades of contact with the medical establishment, identified a foreign object in Homer's skull. Either every doctor in Springfield is incompetent beyond any reasonable interpretation, or some of them knew the crayon was there and chose not to remove it. And if Burns's influence extends into Springfield's healthcare infrastructure, if the doctors are operating under pressures that keep them from asking certain questions about their patient's neurological status, then Homer's crayon isn't an accident. It's a maintained condition. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains. Something that keeps them unable to look at the cracked cooling towers and ask the most basic question available to them. Why are we all like this? The radiation theory doesn't just explain one Springfield mystery, it explains all of them. The characters don't age because their mutated biology has been altered at the cellular level in ways that affect normal aging processes. The town resets after catastrophic events because its population's memory function has been compromised by chronic neurological damage. Homer survives injuries that should kill him because his body has adapted to environmental radiation in ways that make certain aspects of his physiology extraordinarily resilient even as they've destroyed others. Burns stays alive through treatments that would kill a normal human because he's been managing his own radiation exposure for over a century, using resources nobody else in town can access. And nobody in Springfield questions any of it, because the same contamination that altered their bodies also damaged the cognitive architecture required for that kind of questioning. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town. It is a contamination zone. The residents are not eccentric. They are symptomatic. The nuclear power plant that dominates their skyline, that provides their electricity, that employs their neighbors and poisons their water, is not a background element. It is the central fact of Springfield's existence. Every yellow face, every protruding eye, every impossible physical recovery, every forgotten catastrophe, every reset, every unexplained mutation. It all comes from the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible material into the same water supply, feeding the same damaged brains that can't figure out why their fish have 3 eyes. Tier S. The show has been telling you this since the 2nd season. You just had to decide to listen. Section 11. Tier S. Plus, Springfield's collective amnesia is deliberate and systematic. This is the final tier, and it's here because this theory is not in competition with the others. It contains them. Let's begin with the episode that proved it, and which was almost universally misunderstood when it aired. Season 9, Episode 2. The Principal and the Pauper. Broadcast the 28th of September, 1997. The most hated episode in the show's long history. Consistently ranked at or near the bottom of fan polls. The episode that fans have cited for over 20 years as the moment The Simpsons betrayed its own continuity and stopped respecting its audience. Here's what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. A stranger arrives. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was believed dead after capture as a prisoner of war. He survived. He escaped. He came home. And he found that someone else had been living his life for 20 years. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, he was a street criminal, a kid from the margins with no prospects. He was drafted, served in the same unit as the real Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to Skinner's mother, Agnes. Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be. Tamzarian, who had never had a family or a home or an identity worth protecting, went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the relationship, the life, for 20 years. And then the real Skinner walked through the door, and everything collapsed. Now here is where Springfield does something that fans called lazy writing, and which is actually the most honest thing the show ever did. The town holds a meeting. Both men are present. The truth is fully established. Everyone in Springfield knows that their principal is a fraud, and that the real Seymour Skinner is standing in the room. And the town votes not on what to do about this situation legally or ethically. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The vote is unanimous. They choose the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree. The imposter is the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the genuine war hero who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his life occupied, is tied to a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. And the judge makes it explicitly illegal to ever mention the truth again under penalty of torture. Fans hated this. Harry Shearer, the voice actor who plays Skinner, publicly criticized the episode. Critics said it destroyed Skinner's character by revealing his history as fiction. The episode is a wound in the show's reputation that has not fully healed. But here is what the episode actually is. It is the only time The Simpsons shows you the mechanism. Every other time Springfield forgets something catastrophic, it happens between episodes. The dome is sealed and then the dome is gone. The town is destroyed and then the town is intact. The catastrophe occurs and the next week everything is normal. Fans call this episodic storytelling. The coma theory calls it a dreaming brain resetting between cycles. The radiation theory calls it neurological damage from chronic exposure. But the principal and the pauper offers a fourth explanation, and it's the one that makes the most structural sense. Springfield resets because the town chooses to reset, collectively, deliberately. Through an unspoken social contract that operates the way the explicit legal decree in this episode operates, we will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed-upon version of reality. We will treat the lie as truth and the truth as criminal. Anyone who insists on the real version of events will be removed from the community. The episode is not a continuity error. It is the architecture of Springfield's collective amnesia made visible for the first time. Every other instance of Springfield forgetting something, every other reset, every other impossible recovery from irreversible catastrophe happens through this same mechanism, just invisibly. The vote happens off-screen. The decree is unspoken. The real Skinner is expelled quietly rather than tied to a literal train. But the structure is the same. Springfield doesn't forget because its residents are stupid. It forgets because remembering is too dangerous. If they remember the dome, they have to acknowledge the contamination. If they acknowledge the contamination, they have to confront the power plant. If they confront the power plant, they have to challenge Burns. If they challenge Burns, the economy is at risk. If the economy fails, the town itself is at risk. So they forget. They vote to forget. And anyone who insists on the truth, anyone who keeps pointing at the thing everyone agreed to look away from, gets tied to a railroad car. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's most honest man. He showed up with proof that the official narrative was a lie. He wasn't threatening anyone. He was just telling the truth. And the town's response was to criminalize the truth and exile the person delivering it. This is not a cartoon trope. This is how real communities function when the truth is too expensive. Small towns across American history have buried scandals, rewritten events, collectively agreed on a version of reality that protected the people who needed protecting at the expense of the people who deserved honesty. The mechanism is old. The show just dramatized it in Springfield's register. Now here is where the S-plus theory exceeds all the others. The theory being ranked here is not simply that Springfield forgets things. That's just an observation about the show's format. The theory is that Springfield's collective amnesia is a functional system, deliberately maintained, systematically operated, and ultimately traceable to the same source as every other structural problem in Springfield. The power plant produces contamination that damages the population's cognitive function. The cognitive damage makes critical thinking difficult. The difficulty of critical thinking creates vulnerability to institutional manipulation. Burns's institutional influence, which extends into politics, healthcare, media, and law, exploits that vulnerability to shape what the town believes and remembers. The forgetting is both biological and cultural. It happens in the neurons, and it happens in the social contract simultaneously. And when someone like the real Seymour Skinner, or like Mona Simpson, or like any character who arrives with proof of the true shape of things, breaks through both layers of that amnesia, the town has an answer ready, not an argument, not a refutation, an expulsion. This is the theory that contains all the others because it explains not just what Springfield is, but why it stays that way. The radiation explains the mutations and the cognitive damage. The coma explains the aging freeze and the surrealism. The Burns conspiracy explains the political and economic architecture of the town's corruption. The Mona Simpson story explains how the corruption was used against the Simpson family specifically. The Who Shot Burns mystery is one of the clearest examples of the Springfield verdict machine, a finding of official guilt that protects the right people and assigns blame to someone who can never push back. And underneath all of it, underneath the floating timeline and the yellow skin and the three-eyed fish and the man who glows in the dark, is a town that has collectively agreed to not see what it sees. That has voted, in every possible way available to a community, to maintain the lie rather than confront the truth. That has made honesty illegal and called the result normalcy. Springfield isn't a quirky place that funny things happen in. It is a machine for producing and sustaining a specific kind of managed reality. Burns runs the machine, the radiation fuels it, the cognitive damage lubricates it. The cultural amnesia is its output. And the show has been depicting this machine in operation for 36 years, dressed in jokes, laughed at and loved, never quite confronted directly, because the show understood something important. The best way to tell people a hard truth is to make them laugh while you're saying it. The best way to show someone the bars of their cage is to make the cage look funny. The Simpsons has been a comedy for 36 years. But underneath the comedy, underneath every joke and every gag and every couch sequence, it has been a precise and unflinching portrait of what happens to a community when unchecked institutional power meets a population too damaged to resist it. Tier S+. The theory that contains all the theories. The frame that holds all the pictures. Section 12. Bonus deep dives Hans Mollemann, Ned Flanders, and the floating timeline. Let's slow down a little further now. The big theories have been placed, the rankings are done, but Springfield has some smaller mysteries worth sitting with before we close the door. These don't fit neatly into the tiered structure because they're more like final illuminations than standalone arguments. Little lanterns at the end of the hallway. Hans Mollemann. If you've watched The Simpsons for any length of time, you know him. The tiny, elderly, nearly blind man who exists primarily in the background of Springfield scenes and whose purpose, from a purely narrative standpoint, appears to be suffering. He gets struck by vehicles. He is crushed by falling objects. He is buried alive. He is consumed by animals. He is struck by lightning. He burns. He is involved in collisions of every conceivable kind. He is, by any conservative count, the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. The show kills Hans Moleman repeatedly in canonical episodes, not Treehouse of Horror Halloween specials which exist outside continuity, regular episodes, and then he appears in the following episode, alive and complete, ready for the next catastrophe, with no explanation and no acknowledgement that anything unusual has occurred. Most viewers accept this as a running joke. Mole Man dies a lot. It's funny. Don't look at it too hard. Under the radiation theory, Moleman's recurring death suggests something more unsettling. He may represent the most extreme mutation case in Springfield. A man whose biology has been so fundamentally altered by nuclear exposure that death itself has become a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. He doesn't survive his deaths the way Homer survives trauma. Homer endures damage and heals. Moleman actually dies, as in his body ceases to function and then reconstitutes. If radiation has been altering cellular biology in Springfield for decades, Moleman could represent the end point of that alteration, a form of biological resilience that operates at a level beyond anything else the show depicts. Under the coma theory, Moleman is a minor background process in Homer's dream, a filler character that Homer's unconscious mind doesn't maintain consistently. He dies because the dreaming brain occasionally lets minor characters lapse when it's focused elsewhere, and he reappears because the dream needs him to populate subsequent scenes. He is the most honest representation of what a dreamed character would look like, someone who exists when needed, ceases when not, and is reassembled without continuity each time the dream requires him. Under the collective amnesia theory, Moleman's deaths are just another thing Springfield has agreed not to notice. A man dies in public, repeatedly, in front of witnesses, and nobody investigates. Nobody calls for an ambulance. Nobody asks how he keeps coming back. The town has normalized this the same way it normalized everything else that should prompt questions. There is one canonical detail about Moleman that makes all of this darker than it already is. He once stated his age as 31 years old. 31. He appears visually to be in his 80s or 90s at the very minimum. If he is not lying, and the show gives no indication that he is, then something has aged him catastrophically. Something took a man in the early stages of his adult life and compressed decades of visible biological aging into a period that should have produced no aging at all. Something that also, apparently, made him impossible to kill permanently. The only theory that doesn't have an answer for Moleman is the one that says The Simpsons is just a cartoon and none of it means anything. Every serious reading of Springfield has a more interesting response. Ned Flanders deserves a long and careful look, because Ned is the character the show has quietly destroyed more completely than any other, and the darkness under his relentless warmth is one of the most genuinely unsettling elements in the entire series. On the surface, Ned Flanders is everything Homer is not, and the contrast is built deliberately into their placement as next-door neighbors. Ned is kind. He is generous. He is devoutly religious in a way that appears genuine rather than performative. He is physically fit. He is financially responsible. He is a good father to his sons Rod and Totha. He is a good neighbor, despite living next to a man whose behavior would strain the goodwill of anyone less committed to patience and grace. By any objective measure, Ned Flanders is a better person than Homer Simpson in every dimension that conventional morality would identify as important, and the show punishes him for it, continuously, without apology. His wife Maud was killed at the Springfield Speedway when a t-shirt cannon misfired and sent a cluster of t-shirts in a direction that knocked her from the bleachers. She died. Well, she died because Homer was in the path the t-shirts should have taken and reflexively moved out of the way. Homer's instinct to avoid discomfort directed the killing velocity at Maud instead. Homer's selfishness, expressed in a single involuntary movement, killed Ned's wife, and Ned forgave him, because that's what Ned does. The show returned to Ned's capacity for forgiveness many times after Maud's death. Each time, the situation that required that forgiveness was caused directly or indirectly by Homer's behavior. Each time, Ned forgave. Each time, the act of forgiveness seemed to cost Ned something that wasn't visible from outside, a subtle compressing of something internal, a slight tightening that the warmth of his surface presentation concealed. And then the hurricane episode arrived. In the episode where a hurricane destroys Ned's house and the community rallies to rebuild it, the rebuilt structure collapses immediately because it was assembled by Springfield's residents with more enthusiasm than skill. And Ned, who has absorbed decades of punishment with grace, snaps. He has a complete psychological breakdown. He screams at the town. He inventories every person who has ever wronged him and tells them precisely what he thinks. He says things he has been holding inside for years, maybe decades. And then he is institutionalized. The mental health facility that treats him reveals something that reframes Ned's entire history. His relentless kindness is not natural. It is the outcome of extensive behavioral conditioning performed on him in childhood. Ned was a genuinely violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, being somewhat hands-off in their parenting philosophy, brought him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through therapeutic reprogramming. The kindness, the patience, the warmth, they are not character traits that emerged organically from Ned's nature. They are a psychological structure built around a different nature. Ned's actual nature. Everything about Ned's life reads differently with that knowledge. His patience with Homer is not the natural expression of a gentle person. It is the programmed response of someone whose nervous system was rewired to suppress anger as thoroughly as possible. He cannot express rage not because he doesn't feel it, but because the rage was conditioned into dormancy before he was old enough to know it was there. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death was not grace. It was the only response his conditioning permitted. He couldn't choose to be furious even if he wanted to be. His faith is, from this perspective, something more complex than simple conviction. It is the framework that a man needs when he's been conditioned to never allow himself the emotional release that anger normally provides. Faith becomes the container for everything that can't go anywhere else. The suffering goes to God. The confusion goes to Scripture. The grief goes to prayer. Faith is doing for Ned what a normally functioning emotional system would do for everyone else. And then there is the question of God. The show's continuity across multiple episodes establishes that God exists within Springfield's universe. God has spoken directly to Homer on at least 2 occasions. God gave Homer face-to-face theological conversation, warm and immediate, in Homer the Heretic. God communicated with Homer again in subsequent episodes. God in the Springfield universe is real and accessible, at least to Homer. Ned Flanders has dedicated his life to God. He attends church every week. He reads his Bible. He prays with consistency and apparent sincerity. He raised his children in devout faith. He extended his faith into every relationship, every choice, every aspect of his daily existence. If anyone in Springfield should be the recipient of divine conversation, of the kind of direct contact that the show has canonically established as possible, it is Ned. God has never spoken to Ned. Not once in the show's run. God speaks to Homer, who falls asleep in church, who abandons his faith when it's inconvenient, who worships a television set on a Sunday rather than attending services. The drunk who can't stay awake through a homily gets divine communication. The man who has oriented his entire life around his faith gets silence. This is not an accident in the show's construction. It is a thesis statement. The Simpsons is telling you something specific about how the system works. Goodness is not rewarded in Springfield. Devotion is not answered. The system, whether you call it Burns's empire or the radiation or the cultural machinery of collective denial, does not calibrate its outcomes based on moral behavior. It rewards compliance and punishes inconvenience. And Ned is compliant. He was made compliant before he was old enough to resist. His conditioning made him the most manageable person in Springfield. His reward is a dead wife, a rebuilt house that collapsed, a neighbor who will never become what Ned needs him to become, and a God who apparently has time for Homer's theological conversations and none for Ned's lifetime of devotion. Ned Flanders is the most tragic figure in a show full of tragic figures, and his tragedy is the quietest one. Homer's suffering is large and loud and comedic. Ned's suffering is precise and private and continuous. The gap between what Ned has given and what Ned has received is the show's most honest measurement of what Springfield actually is. Homer lives next door to Ned. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. Homer does everything wrong and suffers no permanent consequences. Ned does everything right and receives no permanent rewards. The gap between them has never closed. The show, in its deepest register, is asking you to notice that the gap doesn't close. That the gap is the point. The floating timeline. Bart Simpson was 10 years old in December 1989. He is 10 years old now. Lisa was 8. She is 8 now. Maggie was 1. Still 1. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. Still there. 36 years in the real world. 0 years in Springfield. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. The present in the show is always the viewer's present. When the episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. The technology around them is contemporary. The cultural references are current, but the characters themselves do not move. They are temporally fixed at the ages they occupied in 1989, living through a perpetually current present that never adds a year to their ages. Most long-running animated shows use some version of this. The Simpsons has used it longer than any other, and long enough that the contradictions have become genuinely profound. The backstory problem is the most visible. When the show began, Homer and Marge's formative years were grounded in the 1970s. Their high school experience, their courtship, their early married life, all of it was anchored in a specific cultural moment that made sense for two people in their mid-30s in 1989. As the floating timeline dragged the present forward, the backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they didn't meet in 1980. They met approximately in 2005. Their high school years were defined by things that didn't exist when the show started. The grunge era replaced the disco era. The millennial experience replaced the baby boomer experience. Their origin story has been retold at least 4 times, each version placing their formative years in a different decade, keeping the emotional content the same while the cultural clothing changes. Homer and Marge don't have a fixed past. They have an approximation. They have whatever version of their history the current episode needs. Their memories are not a record of what happened. They are a draft that gets revised every few years to maintain the illusion of a contemporary present. All 5 major theories converge on this point. Every theory arrives at the same conclusion through a different path. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went to sleep in 1993. The radiation theory says nobody ages because their biology has been altered in ways that affect normal aging processes. The collective denial theory says nobody ages because Springfield has agreed to ignore the truth of time passing. The Burns immortality theory says that aging is already negotiable in this universe, that at least one person has found a technical workaround to it. And the prediction theory says the show exists in such tight feedback with American culture that the distinction between the show aging and America aging has blurred. They are all saying the same thing in different registers. Time doesn't work normally in Springfield. But here is the dimension of the floating timeline that goes beyond Springfield and into something larger. The Simpsons is the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as The Simpsons depicts it, is not permitted to change. Homer must remain middle-aged, Marge must remain patient, Bart must remain 10 and rebellious, Lisa must remain 8 and idealistic, Maggie must remain 1 and silent. The structure of the family must be preserved because the structure of the family is what the audience is watching. The moment Bart goes to college and Lisa moves across the country and Homer retires and the house on Evergreen Terrace empties, the show stops being a comedy about the American family and becomes an elegy for it. America doesn't want that story. America wants the version where the kids are always young enough to come home to, where the parents are always together in the house they've always lived in, where Friday night means that specific living room with that specific couch and those specific people. America wants the family frozen at the moment of maximum warmth and accessibility. And The Simpsons obliges. Has always obliged. Has been obliging since 1989 and will apparently continue obliging for as long as there is an audience willing to watch. The floating timeline is not a production convenience. It is a service. It is what the show provides to people who need a home that doesn't change, a family that doesn't age, a world where the couch is always there and the gag always plays and Homer always makes it through the door by dinner. The loop isn't Springfield's trap. It's ours. We constructed it. We maintain it by watching. Every time we return to Evergreen Terrace, every time we laugh at a couch gag, every time we quote a line from an episode that aired before many of us were born, we tighten the loop a little further. We make it a little harder for The Simpsons to do what they should eventually be allowed to do. Grow up. But they can't grow up. Because growing up means the show ends. And the show ending means admitting that the version of American family life it represents was always temporary, always fragile, always one birthday away from becoming something unrecognizable. And that admission is the one thing that Springfield and its audience has agreed never to make. So the timeline floats. The ages hold. The loop continues. And somewhere in Springfield, in a hospital bed at Springfield General, a man is dreaming about his family, and his children are still young, and his wife still loves him, and the house is still warm, and the beer is still cold, and Friday night is still Friday night, and the dream goes on. Section 13, the final ranking and closing. Let's bring it all together. We've spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We've gone through every major theory this show has produced, examined the evidence for each one, and placed them in honest relationship to each other. Here's the final ranking, assembled and complete. Tier F contains the theories with the least canonical support. The purgatory theory, which applies a spiritual framework to what is essentially a structural convention of long-running animation and finds theology where there is mostly production logic. The Kang and Kodos theory, which imports non-canonical Halloween special characters into the show's primary universe without sufficient justification. The non-Homer dream theories, which identify something real about the show's sensibility without finding any internal anchor point that would make them more than aesthetic observations. Tier D contains the theories built on genuine observations that can't support the weight placed on them. The Sideshow Bob deliberate failure theory, which is psychologically rich but unsupported by any canonical confirmation that Bob sabotages himself intentionally. The Nelson's father background character theory, which reads something real about Nelson's story but requires production planning discipline that the show never exercised. The Disco Stew grief theory, which applies emotional depth to a character written as a one-note joke. The early Skinner inconsistency theory, which finds continuity gaps that are more likely production oversights than deliberate foreshadowing. Tier C contains theories with real evidence that falls short of being conclusive. The intentional predictions theory, which correctly identifies that the writing staff's unusual academic caliber makes their cultural extrapolations more accurate than chance would produce, but overstates the deliberateness of the process. The Moe hidden backstory theory, which identifies genuine emotional complexity in a supporting character, but overestimates the writer's long-term planning for that character. The visual palette doom signal theory, which observes something real about the show's visual language, but can't be confirmed at the methodological level currently possible. Tier C+ contains the Who Shot Mr. Burns theory, which has real canonical problems with the official answer, genuine alternative theories supported by the available evidence, and an official solution that the show's own alternate endings suggest was reverse-engineered rather than naturally derived. The official answer is Maggie. The case is not closed. Tier B contains the Maggie theory, which the show's own storytelling supports across decades of consistent evidence. Maggie is not a normal infant. Her intelligence is extraordinary. Her silence is almost certainly strategic. Her capacity for accomplishment, executed below the radar of a family too busy with everyone else's drama to pay close attention to the baby, is the show's most consistently documented hidden truth. Tier B+ contains the Burns immortality theory, which is canonically established rather than inferred. Burns is maintained artificially through weekly radiation treatments. His disease equilibrium is managed rather than natural. Smithers is functionally his life support. The multi-generational dimension of the Burns family's longevity is suggested by the show without being confirmed. Tier A contains the Mona Simpson conspiracy theory, which is spelled out across multiple canonical episodes. Burns destroyed the Simpson family through a sustained personal grudge maintained across 3 generations. Mona was a fugitive because of Burns. Homer works for his mother's persecutor. Abe made a deal with the devil. 3 generations of damage from one man's institutional power. Tier A also contains the Homer coma theory, which explains the aging freeze, the tonal shift, the celebrity inflation, and the progressive surrealism of later seasons more elegantly than any other available theory. The divine warning 6 months before the coma, the specific triggering event, the pattern of increasing dream degradation tracking with the show's quality decline, all of it points in the same direction. Homer has been dreaming since April 1993. Tier S contains the nuclear mutation theory, which the show has explicitly supported since Season 2 through a continuous accumulation of canonical evidence. The 342 violations, the three-eyed fish, the visible green glow, the yellow skin, the four fingers, the superhuman physical resilience combined with catastrophic cognitive damage, the EPA dome, Burns's personal management of radiation exposure, the incompetent safety inspector maintained deliberately. The show has been telling you that Springfield is a contamination zone for 36 years. Blinky was the announcement. And Tier S Plus contains the theory of Springfield's deliberate collective amnesia, the theory that all the forgetting, all the resetting, all the impossible recoveries from catastrophic events is not a failure of continuity, but a feature of Springfield's social operating system. The principal and the pauper showed you the mechanism. The vote, the decree, the expulsion of the honest man. Every other reset in the show's history is that same vote taken off-screen in the unspoken language of a community that has agreed to pay whatever price the comfortable lie requires. This is the theory that contains all the others because it explains not just what Springfield is, but how it stays that way. The radiation explains the damage. The damage enables the manipulation. The manipulation produces the amnesia. The amnesia protects the power plant. The power plant funds Burns. Burns ensures the radiation continues. The loop is closed and self-sustaining and has been running since 1989. There is a question underneath all of these theories that deserves to be the last thing we talk about before we close. Not a theory, a question. The one that the show itself ends up asking, in its most reflective moments, when it stops making jokes long enough to look directly at what it is. Why can't we let them go? The Simpsons has been on for 36 years. Most of its current audience wasn't alive when it started. Many of the people watching it now know, on some level, that it's not what it used to be. That the show's peak seasons produced something that the recent seasons don't quite replicate, that the golden age is over and has been over for a long time. And yet the show continues and people continue to watch and the couch gag keeps playing and every Sunday night Springfield exists. The answer the show itself gestures toward, in its quieter moments, is that we keep watching because we need a home that doesn't change. Because the world outside changes constantly and mostly in directions we didn't ask for, and Springfield is the place that stays. Homer is still Homer. Marge is still Marge. The house is still on Evergreen Terrace. The plant is still there and Burns is still there and the kids are still young and the beer is still cold. We built the loop. We keep it running. Every view, every laugh, every quote, every viral clip of a prediction that came true, we tighten the loop with each one. We make it harder for time to do what time does to the things we love. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's what stories are for. The preservation of something real inside a form that doesn't age. Homer's family is the family everyone wanted, chaotic and warm and imperfect and unbreakable, and the show keeps them in amber for us because amber is what we asked for. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe we keep watching because inside the jokes and the yellow skin and the cracked cooling towers and the impossible recoveries, there's something true. Something about what it feels like to be a person who wants things to stay the same while everything keeps changing. Something about what it means to love people who drive you crazy. Something about the specific weight of ordinary life and the extraordinary effort it takes to show up for it every day. Homer Simpson falls down a lot. He gets back up every time. He doesn't understand most of what's happening to him. He stumbles through a world that has been arranged in ways he can't fully see to keep him small and confused and grateful for whatever scraps of warmth come his way. And he keeps going. Back to the house. Back to the couch. Back to Marge. Back to the kids. Back to whatever Friday night has on offer. Maybe that's the theory that ranks above everything else. Not purgatory or contamination or coma or conspiracy. Just this. Homer keeps going home. Through every catastrophe and reset and impossible event and forgotten disaster, he keeps going home. And that, stripped of everything else, is what 36 years of this show has actually been about. The plant is still there. The family is still in the house. And Homer is still finding his way back by the end of every episode. Because in his dream or in reality, in contamination or in clarity, in the Springfield that the show built and the Springfield that we built inside ourselves while watching it, he never really left. Get some rest. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. That's the whole point. End of script. Total estimated word count, approximately 42,000 plus words. Production notes for 11 Labs voiceover. Pace. This script is written for a calm, deliberate delivery. The narrator should pause naturally at paragraph breaks. Sentence ending periods should be honored with genuine pauses rather than minimal micro-rests. Tone. Think of The Register as a well-researched bedtime story told by someone who genuinely loves this subject. Not performance documentary. Not hype. Thoughtful, warm, occasionally dark, but always grounded and unhurried. Breathing points. The M dashes in the text indicate natural mid-sentence pauses. The section headers, which should not be read aloud, mark natural long pauses between sections. Volume guidance. This should be recorded at a consistent low-medium volume throughout. Emphasis through pace changes and tonal shifts rather than volume spikes. Words that may need phonetic guidance. Tamzarian, Tamzarian. Sislak, Zizlak. Terwilliger, Terwilliger. Higgs boson, Higgs boson. Craniofacial, Cranio, facial. Extended section. The Simpsons and grief. What the show has always been about underneath the jokes. There's a dimension of The Simpsons that almost never comes up in conspiracy theory discussions, because conspiracy theories are, by their nature, about hidden structures and systems and mechanisms, and what we're about to talk about is not hidden at all. It's in the open, in almost every episode, and the reason it goes unremarked is that it's presented inside the comedy with such consistent lightness that you can watch it for decades without registering its full weight. The show is about grief. Not in the melodramatic sense, not in the way that a drama is about grief, with sustained attention and formal acknowledgement that something painful is being worked through. The Simpsons is about grief in the way that family dinners are about grief. The thing is there, present, affecting every interaction, shaping every exchange, and nobody acknowledges it directly, because acknowledging it directly would require the family to become something other than a family, and just be people in pain for a while. Homer grieves for his mother for the first 6 seasons without knowing he's grieving. His personality, the need for approval, the terror of abandonment, the desperate clinging to whatever warmth comes his way, these are the symptoms of unprocessed grief rather than the traits of a man who grew up loved and whole. Homer's hollowness, the specific quality of neediness that makes him both funny and pitiful, comes from a wound that was inflicted when he was very young and that nobody ever helped him address. Lisa grieves for a version of her family that doesn't exist and may never have existed. She grieves for the brilliant future that Springfield seems designed to prevent her from reaching. She grieves for the connections she can't quite make, the relationships that almost work before they don't, the moments of genuine understanding that appear briefly and then recede. Lisa's sadness is not occasional or situational, it's atmospheric. She carries it the way she carries her saxophone. It goes with her everywhere. Bart grieves, though the show is less willing to let him grieve openly, for the version of his father that could give him what he needs. He has a father who loves him. The love is real, and the show confirms it repeatedly. But the specific form of that love, big and chaotic and unreliable and sometimes dangerous, and almost never expressed in the language that Bart would actually hear, leaves Bart with a father-shaped space that the actual father doesn't quite fill. The pranks are reaching. The defiance is reaching. He's been reaching across that gap since 1989, and it hasn't closed. Marge grieves, quietly and continuously, for the life she gave up, not in the way of a woman who regrets her choices. She chose her family, and her choice is genuine, and the show honors it. She grieves in the way of someone who had a life that was going somewhere, and then made a decision that redirected it. And sometimes in the quiet of a Sunday morning before anyone else is awake, she can see both the road she's on and the road she didn't take, and she feels the weight of what it means to have chosen. Even Burns grieves, though his grief is so old and so calcified that it barely registers as grief anymore. The show has suggested, in scattered moments across its run, that Burns was not always the person he became, that there was a childhood in which he was capable of tenderness, before the money and the ambition and the decades of accumulating power turned those capacities into vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities into things he sealed away. His cruelty is not the expression of someone who was always cruel. It's what you get when someone seals themselves away from their own grief for long enough that the sealing becomes the self. The conspiracy theories in this ranking are, in a sense, all attempts to explain why the show's grief doesn't resolve. Why Homer never gets better, never gets the peace that understanding his own wounds would bring. Why Lisa never gets out. Why Bart never gets what he needs from his father. Why Marge never stops carrying all of it. The radiation explains it chemically. The coma explains it narratively. The collective amnesia explains it structurally. Each theory is asking the same question in a different language. Why can't these people heal? The answer the show gives, underneath all the theories, is simpler than any of them. They can't heal because healing requires time, and time requires aging, and aging is the one thing Springfield has decided it cannot permit. The healing that should come, the conversations that should happen, the growth that should occur across 36 years of a family's life together, these things exist in the space between the age freeze and the present moment, in the time the show won't depict. They happen off-screen, in the years that Springfield refuses to acknowledge have passed, and we can't access them because the loop doesn't allow access. The grief stays fresh because the wound stays fresh. Nothing scabs because nothing ages. And the show keeps making us laugh at it because the laughter is how it keeps us in the room with it long enough for us to feel what it's actually showing us. That's not a conspiracy, but it might be the deepest thing the show has done. Extended section on the question of intentionality. How much did the writers know they were building? Before we close the rankings, there's a meta question that all of these theories raise, and that deserves direct attention. How much of what we've been discussing was intentional? How much of the pattern that the theories identify was placed there deliberately by writers who knew what they were building, and how much emerged from 36 years of talented, observant people doing their jobs well enough that the patterns formed themselves? This question matters because the answer changes how we relate to the show. If the radiation theory is a deliberate narrative that the writers embedded from the beginning and have been maintaining for 3 decades, then we're talking about an act of sustained creative ambition remarkable in the history of television. If it emerged, if writers made individual choices that collectively cohered into a pattern that nobody planned, then we're talking about something possibly more interesting. A show that told the truth about itself through a kind of institutional unconsciousness. The evidence, and there is some, suggests it's a mixture of both. Some elements were clearly intentional from early on. The nuclear plant's hazardous quality was a deliberate satirical choice from the beginning. The show's critique of industrial negligence and its human costs was never accidental. The decision to make Homer a safety inspector at a dangerously maintained facility was a joke with real satirical teeth that the writers knew they were making. The three-eyed fish was a deliberate choice to show you the consequences of the contamination they'd been depicting. The deeper patterns, the ones that the best theories in this ranking are built on, seem to have emerged over time rather than been planned from the start. The Homer coma theory's triggering episode was written as a clip show, a production cost-saving device that uses footage from previous episodes to generate a new episode economically. The writers probably weren't thinking about fan theories when they had the vending machine fall on Homer. They were thinking about how to get from the beginning of the episode to the end. The coma was a plot device. Its implications, accumulated across 30 years of subsequent content, became the theory. The Mona Simpson story was similarly not planned from the first season. Homer's mother being mentioned as dead in early episodes was characterization, a way of explaining Homer's particular flavor of emotional hunger. The decision to bring her back, to reveal that she was alive, to give her story the specific shape it has, came much later. The conspiracy dimensions of that story, Burns as the architect of 3 generations of Simpson damage, emerged from the decision to make Burns responsible for Mona's fugitive status. That connection, once made, revealed the shape of a conspiracy that the show hadn't previously articulated. The Springfield amnesia mechanism was demonstrated rather than announced in The Principal and the Pauper, and the episode's explicit depiction of the vote and the decree was not an acknowledgement of a long-planned narrative. It was a story choice that accidentally, or not accidentally, laid bare the structural logic of the show's own reset convention. The show was making a joke about episodic television's relationship with continuity and inadvertently produced its most honest statement about Springfield's social operating system. What this suggests is that The Simpsons has been telling the truth about itself and about America, partly through intention and partly through the accumulated weight of choices made by many talented people over a very long time. The show has had a genuine satirical intelligence operating within it since the beginning. The specific patterns that the strongest theories identify are the product of that intelligence working consistently in the same direction across decades. The intelligence knew what it was critiquing. The patterns formed in service of the critique, but the full architecture, the degree to which all the pieces fit together into the coherent portrait that the Tier A and S theories describe, that architecture assembled itself through time, rather than being planned from the beginning. This makes the show more interesting rather than less. A conspiracy that was planned from the beginning would be impressive as a feat of construction. A conspiracy that assembled itself through 36 years of consistent satirical intelligence is something rarer. It's a document of what happens when talented people pay honest attention to the world for a very long time. The truth finds its way into the work even when nobody is explicitly planning for it. The patterns emerge because the people making the choices were seeing the same things in the world and responding to them consistently. The Simpsons has been paying honest attention to America since 1989. The theories in this ranking are the record of what that attention accumulated. The radiation and the coma and the amnesia and the conspiracy across 3 generations, these aren't things the writers hid in the show like Easter eggs. They're things the show couldn't help but include because they were what the writers were seeing when they looked at the world they lived in. Springfield is America. The plant is the industry. Burns is the billionaire. The contamination is the cost that gets externalized onto the population that can't resist it. The amnesia is the mechanism that keeps the population from organizing around that cost. The show has been saying this since season 2, when Blinky appeared in the river and the town shrugged and moved on. We're still watching, and we're still moving on. Extended section. The theories we didn't cover, and why some stones are better left unturned. In a project of this scope, covering every theory The Simpsons has ever generated would take considerably longer than one night. There are theories we haven't examined that deserve acknowledgement, even if they don't make the main ranking. The theory about Sideshow Bob's family and the suggestion that the Terwilliger family as a whole represents a specific kind of educated upper-class villainy in Springfield deserves a brief note. The show introduced Bob's brother Cecil and his father and the family dynamic they establish. The theory argues that the Terwilligers are, as a family, the cultural equivalent of what Burns is economically, the representatives of a class-based contempt for Springfield's ordinary residents that operates through aesthetics and refinement rather than industrial power. This theory is interesting but lacks the canonical density to rank higher than Tier D. The Terwilliger family is underused relative to what the theory requires them to support. The theory about Mrs. Bouvier, Marge's mother, and the suggestion that her cold, disappointed relationship with her daughters contains a hidden history of its own represents one of the show's less explored corners of characterization. The evidence is thin, but the observation about the Bouvier family's emotional dynamics is real. Tier D, generously. The theory about Ralph Wiggum and whether his distinctive disconnection from conventional reality represents a neurological condition, a form of extraordinary innocence, or something more specific that the show is depicting with more care than it usually acknowledges, is an interesting question. Ralph's characterization is one of the show's most consistently gentle observations. His view of the world is genuinely different from every other character's, not simply as a joke about childlike confusion, but as a consistent and coherent alternative way of processing experience. Whether this is the show building something deliberate or simply maintaining a character voice that happens to be affecting is unclear. Tier D, because the observation is real but the theory constructed around it is thin. The theory about Mayor Quimby and the suggestion that his characterization contains a specific and historically informed portrait of American municipal corruption that goes beyond the surface parody of the Kennedy accent and manner, this theory has more canonical support than it usually gets credit for. The show has depicted Quimby's corruption with specific, accurate detail across many episodes. The mechanisms by which a small city mayor maintains power and protection against accountability are depicted with enough precision that someone in the writer's room clearly understood them from the inside. Whether this rises to the level of a theory or is simply good research and good writing is the question. Tier C on the generous end. And the theory about the Simpsons house itself, the claim that 742 Evergreen Terrace has an internal geography that changes between episodes in ways that are too systematic to be simple production inconsistency, This theory is both charming and hard to evaluate. Animation production across 36 years, with multiple teams, multiple directors, and multiple approaches to visualizing the same space, will inevitably produce inconsistencies. The question is whether the inconsistencies follow a pattern. The analysis that's been done on this question is interesting but not conclusive. Tier D. The point being made by listing these is not that the lower tier theories are worthless. It's that the show has produced such a volume of content, with such genuine intelligence and such consistent attention to the world it's depicting, that even the theories that can't be confirmed contain real observations. The show is worth looking at closely. It has been worth looking at closely for 36 years and shows no sign of becoming less interesting to look at closely. What we've assembled tonight is a ranking of how well supported the theories are, not a ranking of how interesting they are to think about. The most interesting theory might not be the best supported one. The best supported ones are often the ones that are interesting in the way that painful truths are interesting, undeniably, uncomfortably, and in a way that you can't unsee once you've seen it. Extended final section, what Springfield means now. It's late or early, depending on what time you started and how far you've come through this. The light in the room is probably the same color it was when you began, because you've been in one place while all of this passed through you. Springfield has a way of doing that, making you still while it moves through the space around you. We've spent a long night in a town that doesn't appear on any map and never will. We've looked at every major theory about what Springfield is and why it works the way it works, and we've placed them in honest order from the ones with the least evidence to the ones where the evidence is so strong that calling it a theory feels almost like underselling it. The nuclear contamination is real within the show's logic. The cognitive damage is real. Burns' artificial immortality is real. The conspiracy across 3 generations of Simpsons is real. The collective amnesia is real. The question of whether Homer woke up from a coma in 1993 remains open in a way that the show has never definitively closed, despite claiming to. And underneath all of it, the show keeps running. The couch gag plays. Homer drives into the garage. The family assembles on the couch. The television turns on. There's something almost ritualistic about that. The opening credits of The Simpsons are among the most recognized in the history of television. The music, the sequence, the specific order of events as each family member makes their way home. People who haven't watched the show in years can still see it when they close their eyes. The sequence is embedded in cultural memory with a depth that suggests it's operating as something more than an introduction to a cartoon. It's the coming home. That's what the opening credits are. They're the visual representation of a family coming home to itself at the end of the day, each person arriving from somewhere different, from their own version of the world outside, converging on the house, sitting on the couch together. The family assembles. The television turns on. The day's business is done. For viewers, particularly for viewers who grew up watching the show, the opening credits serve a function similar to what they depict. They're the signal that you're home, that you're back in the place you know, that the family is intact and the couch is there, and whatever is going to happen tonight is going to happen in a house that is familiar and a world that is known. The show has been performing this function for 36 years. That's a long time to be someone's sense of home, which is why the theories we've been discussing feel different when you really sit with them. Because all of them, the ones at the bottom of the ranking and the ones at the top, are asking the same question. Is the home you think you have actually safe? Is the place you keep coming back to actually what it presents itself as? Is the warmth you feel when the couch gag plays the warmth of genuine safety? Or is it the warmth of a place so thoroughly managed that the management has made you comfortable rather than actually comfortable? The radiation theory says the home is poisoned. The coma theory says the home exists only in a dream. The collective amnesia theory says the home's apparent stability is the product of everyone agreeing not to look at what's destabilizing it. The Burns conspiracy says the home's warmth is possible only because someone else is paying a price for it that the residents of the home never acknowledge. These are dark answers to the question. And yet the show keeps running, and we keep watching, and the couch is still there, and the family assembles every week. Maybe that's because the theories and the warmth aren't incompatible. Maybe a home can be poisoned and still be home. Maybe a dream can be the truest version of what someone needed. Maybe collective agreement about what to acknowledge and what to let pass is not entirely different from the grace that makes any family functional. Maybe the warmth you feel on the couch watching Homer fall downstairs is real warmth, not despite everything that Springfield contains, but alongside it. The theories don't close Springfield down. They open it up. They make it larger and stranger and more honest than its surface register suggests. They make the comedy carry more weight than it looks like it's carrying. They make Homer's survival of every catastrophe feel less like a reset and more like insistence. The insistence of someone who refuses to accept that the story is over. Who keeps getting up because the family is still in the house and the beer is still cold and there is still one more evening to be had on Evergreen Terrace? Homer keeps going home, through every theory and every catastrophe and every reset, through the radiation and the coma and the conspiracy and the amnesia, through 36 years of a world that was built to keep him small and compliant and unaware of the shape of his own damage. Homer keeps going home, and that, in the end, is what the show has been about. Not the nuclear plant, not the billionaire, not the mutations or the mystery or the memory that won't hold. The going home, the finding your way back. The stubborn, inarticulate, improbable insistence that the couch is still there and the family is still intact and tonight is still worth having. Homer stumbles through the door every episode. He doesn't know what he's done. He doesn't know what's been done to him. He doesn't have the cognitive architecture to understand the full shape of his situation. But he comes home. And in the end, after everything the theories can show you, after all the evidence and all the rankings and all the dark patterns embedded in 36 years of animated comedy, the going home is still the most real thing in Springfield. Let that carry you into sleep. The house is still there. The family is still together. And Homer will be home before you wake up. He always is. End of full script. Estimated total word count, 42,000 plus words. Extended section, The Simpsons and the American Working Class. Homer as a historical figure. There's a reading of Homer Simpson that academic and cultural critics have been developing for years, one that places him in a specific historical context that the show itself was always aware of even if it never spelled it out directly. Homer is, in his bones, a portrait of the American working-class man of a very specific generation. The generation that came of age in the 1970s, entered the workforce in the early 1980s, and found a world that had promised them something particular and was quietly in the process of delivering something else entirely. When the show began, Homer worked at a nuclear power plant for a man who could not remember his name. He had a wife, 3 children, and a modest house in a small town. He drove a car. He drank beer at a local bar. He watched television. He went to church on Sundays, occasionally, without much enthusiasm. He was, in the language of his era, comfortably lower middle class. He was the person that America, in the mythology of that era, was supposed to produce in abundance. The man who works hard, raises a family, and arrives at the end of the day at a table where there is food and a television and people who know his name. What the show gradually revealed over its run is that this situation, which Homer inhabits as a kind of permanent given, is not as stable as its mythology presents it. The house exists because of specific economic conditions that the show gradually reveals are contingent rather than guaranteed. Burns can and does threaten Homer's employment repeatedly. The house has been lost and recovered. The specific flavor of economic anxiety that the show uses as recurring engine, the one that puts Homer into new schemes and new jobs and new situations every week, is the anxiety of a man who understands, at some level he rarely articulates, that the stability he inhabits is one serious mistake away from dissolution. This is the economic anxiety of the generation the show was depicting. The people who grew up believing in a specific compact between labor and capital, between the worker and the employer, that the show depicts as having been quietly voided sometime around when Homer was too distracted to notice. Burns represents not just individual villainy, but the institutional reality that replaced that compact. The employer who regards his workers as expenses rather than investments. The billionaire who has so thoroughly externalized the costs of his business onto the community around him that the community no longer has the language to describe what is being done to it. Homer's inability to connect the dots between Burns and his own suffering is not simply the result of low intelligence or radiation damage or a crayon in his brain, though all of those elements are present. It's also the result of a specific form of false consciousness that the show depicts with genuine sympathy rather than condescension. Homer doesn't see what Burns has done to him because he was raised in an ideology that told him what he has is a fair exchange for what he gives. He works. He is paid. He has a house and a family and a television. The ideology says this is the compact and the compact is just. The show has always known that the compact is not just. That Burns takes far more than he gives. That the contamination is the cost externalized onto the people who have no choice but to absorb it. That the cognitive damage serves Burns's interests because a population that can think clearly would not continue to accept these terms. The show has been depicting a class war conducted in such slow motion, with such effective concealment, that the people on the losing side can't see they're in a war at all. Homer is not stupid because Homer is a bad person. Homer is cognitively impaired for reasons that trace back to the environment he was raised in and the employer who benefits from his impairment. But even without the radiation, even without the crayon, even without 30 years of walking past cracked cooling towers, Homer would face the challenge that every working-class person faces when trying to understand the full architecture of their own situation. The ideology that makes the exploitation seem fair is doing work that the radiation and the crayons simply reinforce. The damage is real, but it was always already underway before the contamination started. The conspiracy theory of Burns's deliberate management of Homer is true in this broader sense, even if the specific mechanism of deliberate cognitive targeting can't be confirmed. Burns manages the conditions that produce Homer's compliance. Whether he does this with full strategic consciousness or simply as a natural expression of the incentives his position creates, the result is the same. Homer works at the plant. The violations continue. The contamination continues. The compliance is maintained. And Homer comes home to the family he loves, in the house he can barely afford, in the town whose water is slowly doing things to everyone inside it, and he watches television, and he is content, and the couch is warm, and everything is fine. The Simpsons has been one of the most sustained explorations of working-class American experience in the history of the medium. It did this through comedy, which is the form that working-class experience has most often chosen to take. The pathos is in the comedy. The accuracy is in the comedy. The protest is in the comedy. Homer falls down and gets back up, and you laugh, and you recognize him, and you love him, and somewhere underneath the love there is something that isn't quite comfortable, a recognition of what the laughter is covering. The theory being articulated here doesn't have a tier ranking because it's less a theory about hidden content and more an observation about what the show's visible surface content actually depicts when you hold it up to the light. It's there in every episode. It doesn't require conspiracy reading. It's just the show, being honest about the world it was made in. Extended section: the question of Lisa's future, and what Springfield costs its smartest residents. Lisa Simpson is going to leave Springfield. The show has depicted this in flash-forward episodes, and it is the most intuitively certain thing about her future that the show has established. She will leave. She will go to university, possibly Harvard, based on various episode futures. She will become whatever she becomes, a president, or a jazz musician, or a scientist, or some combination of things the show has gestured toward at different moments. She will leave the house on Evergreen Terrace. The question the theories around Lisa's character keep circling is, what leaving will cost her? Because Springfield, as we've established, is a contamination zone. Its effects on the biology and cognition of the people who live there have been documented across 3 decades of episodes. Lisa has grown up in that environment. She has been drinking the water since before she was born, given that Marge was exposed to the plant before Lisa's conception. She has been breathing the air of a town the EPA classified as an environmental hazard. Is Lisa's genius actually her genius? Or is it a mutation produced by the same environmental conditions that reduced Homer's intelligence to clinical disability range? The theory that Maggie's exceptional intelligence is the other side of Homer's exceptional cognitive damage, the same contamination expressing differently in different individuals, applies to Lisa as well. Lisa was tested early in life, and her intelligence registered as extraordinary. The show has established this as simply a fact about her character, but within the radiation theory, it's a fact that requires a question. Where did that intelligence come from? And what is it going to do to her over time? The mutation theory doesn't promise stability. It doesn't promise that the cognitive amplification the contamination produces in people like Lisa and Maggie will remain stable across a lifetime. It promises variance. It promises unpredictability. The three-eyed fish developed an extra eye, but extra eyes aren't necessarily advantageous in every environment. The mutation is not improvement. It's alteration. Lisa's situation is further complicated by the emotional damage she has accumulated over 8 years, the same 8 years that have lasted 36 years in real time. She has been the smartest person in every room she's been in, and she has been consistently undervalued for it. She has developed the specific kind of resilience that intelligence develops in hostile environments, brittle and precise, capable of extraordinary performance under pressure, and equally capable of catastrophic brittleness when the pressure comes from the wrong direction. She is going to leave Springfield eventually. And when she does, she is going to carry with her not just her extraordinary mind, but everything Springfield put into that mind. The theory about what Lisa carries out of Springfield is less optimistic than the flash-forward episodes suggest. The episodes that show Lisa's future show her accomplished and somewhat lonely and searching for connection in ways that echo her 8-year-old self. The accomplishment is there. The searching is also there. The show is telling you that some things about Springfield follow you when you leave. The contamination you can leave behind when you leave the water supply. The emotional landscape. The specific texture of what it means to have grown up feeling perpetually misunderstood in a house that loves you but can't quite hear you, that travels. It's in the way she carries herself, in what she expects from relationships, in the specific frequency of her loneliness, which is the loneliness of someone who has always been surrounded by people who care for her and still somehow been alone. Lisa is going to get out. The show is certain of this, even if it's never going to show it canonically. And when she gets out, she's going to do something extraordinary. The evidence for that is in everything she's already done at 8 years old, in a contaminated town with a father who loves her more than he can express, and a community that doesn't know what to do with her. But she's going to be carrying Springfield with her. In the water she drank, in the air she breathed, in the specific shape of the wound that, growing up too smart in the wrong place, leaves in a person. The show has been too kind to Lisa in its flash-forward episodes, or perhaps accurate in a way that doesn't require the theories. It shows her accomplished and still reaching. Still looking for the thing she couldn't find in Springfield. Still the 8-year-old who raised her hand in a classroom that didn't know what to do with the answer. Springfield got inside her before she was old enough to protect herself from it. And when she leaves, some of it comes with her. That's not a conspiracy. But it might be the show's deepest kindness to Lisa. The acknowledgement that the town she grew up in will never fully let go of her, even after she's gone. Extended section, Homer's relationship with death, and why he never stays hurt. Homer Simpson has died. Multiple times, in multiple contexts, with varying degrees of canonical finality. He has been declared dead. He has flatlined. He has been in circumstances from which no normal human biology could recover. And every time, he comes back. Unchanged, unhurt, ready for the next disaster. The show handles this through the specific logic of its comedic register. Death and serious injury are available as comedic tools in animated comedy in a way they aren't in live action. The cartoon body can absorb things the live-action body cannot. Homer falls off a cliff and lands at the bottom, and you laugh because the physics of the gag require him to survive, and the show's register tells you that survival is the expected outcome. But the theories we've been examining all week don't accept this surface explanation, and they each offer a different reading of Homer's apparent indestructibility. The radiation theory's reading is the most biologically interesting. If 30 years of nuclear contamination have fundamentally altered Homer's cellular biology, if his body has adapted to chronic radiation exposure in ways that produce both extraordinary physical resilience and catastrophic cognitive damage, then Homer's survival of physically impossible events is not cartoon convenience. It's mutation. His healing rate is not natural. His pain tolerance is not within the range of ordinary human experience. His body has become something different from what it started as, and one of the differences is a capacity for physical recovery that approaches the supernatural. The show supports this reading in specific episodes where Homer's physical resilience is treated as a genuine diagnostic fact rather than a joke. The episode where Homer's skull is revealed to be unusually thick, protecting his brain from trauma that would be fatal to normal people, is played as comedy but also as canonical anatomy. Homer's body is built differently than other bodies in Springfield. The show has established this as factual within its universe. The coma theory's reading is the most emotionally resonant. Homer can't die in the dream because the dream is keeping him alive. His body in the hospital bed is still running. As long as the body lives, the dream runs. The dream's Homer can absorb any damage because the damage is not happening to the body that matters. Only the body in the hospital bed can actually die. And that body is being maintained by the medical infrastructure of Springfield General, and by Marge sitting beside it, and by the family that is presumably waiting for Homer to come back to them. In this reading, every time Homer survives something impossible, it's the dream confirming that the dreamer is still breathing. The impossibility of his survival is the impossibility of the dream ending before Homer decides to let it end. The coma will close when the body closes. Until then, the dream Homer cannot die. He can only fall down and get back up, endlessly, like a man who refuses to accept that falling down is the same as being finished. The collective amnesia theory offers a darker reading. Homer's survival of impossible events is possible in Springfield, because Springfield has agreed that Homer survives. The same social mechanism that agreed the Tamsarian version of Skinner was the real Skinner. The same collective choice to maintain the version of events that the community needs to maintain has agreed that Homer is the kind of person who falls off things and gets back up. Questioning Homer's survival would mean questioning the stability of the family that anchors Springfield's narrative. The family must be intact, therefore Homer must survive. The community's need for him to survive is the mechanism that ensures he does. This is a slightly metaphysical reading of the collective amnesia theory, but it has a certain internal consistency. Springfield's reality is managed by collective agreement. The agreements that matter most are the ones that protect the town's fundamental structure. Homer being alive and at home is more fundamental to Springfield's structure than almost anything else. Of course he survives. The alternative is unthinkable, and Springfield is very good at not thinking the unthinkable. The question of Homer's relationship with death connects to the theory about what would happen if Homer actually died. Not in a clip show or a dream sequence or a treehouse of horror. Really died, in canon, permanently. The show has occasionally approached this question obliquely in late-season episodes that deal with Homer's age and health, and the approach is always the same. The possibility is introduced, circled, and then retreated from. The show cannot commit to Homer's death because Homer's death is the end of the show and the end of everything the show represents. Homer is the show. He is the center around which everything orbits. If Homer dies, the orbit has no center. The family dissolves, the house empties, the loop breaks. And Springfield, which has been sustained by the collective agreement to maintain the loop, would have to confront what it looks like when the thing at the center stops going home. This is why the coma theory's emotional logic is so compelling. Homer is in a coma. His body is at risk. The dream cannot continue if the body fails. And so the dream does everything it can to survive. It generates content endlessly. It escalates the fantasy. It fills the screen with celebrities and adventures and impossible events. It keeps the loop running, keeps Homer coming home, keeps the family intact. Because as long as the dream runs, the dreamer is still alive. As long as the dream runs, there's still time for Homer to wake up and actually be home. That's the hope the coma theory leaves you with. Not that Homer is in a coma, which is devastating, but that the dream has been running for 32 years, which means Homer has been alive for 32 years, which means there is still time. The dream won't end unless the dreamer ends. And the dreamer is still breathing. Homer keeps surviving because there are still people waiting. Extended section. The show's relationship with its own legacy and what it means to be the longest-running anything. The Simpsons is the longest-running American animated series, the longest-running American scripted primetime series, the longest-running primetime sitcom in television history. These are the records it holds, and it holds all of them by a margin that makes comparison almost meaningless. The second longest-running shows in these categories ended before The Simpsons was halfway through its current run. What does it mean for a show to be this long? Not just long-running in the sense of having many episodes, but genuinely long, measured in decades, in cultural eras, in the lifetimes of its viewers? What does it mean for the conspiracy theories that have accumulated around it? It means the theories have to account for something that theories about shorter-running shows don't have to account for. The show has outlived its original cultural context. The world that The Simpsons satirized in 1989 no longer exists in the form it existed then. The economy is different. The media landscape is different. The political conditions are different. The family structures being satirized have changed. The industry being depicted has changed. Springfield, frozen in its impossible geographic and temporal ambiguity, has watched the world change around it across 36 years and has somehow remained relevant to a cultural conversation that is barely recognizable from the one it started in. This longevity creates a specific problem for theory making. When you're building a theory about a show that has been running for 36 years, you're building a theory about a thing that was being made by different people, in different circumstances, with different intentions, at different moments in cultural history. The show made in 1989 was being made by a specific group of writers with specific concerns. The show being made now is being made by different people with different concerns. The continuity between those two versions of the show is real, but it's not the continuity of a single coherent vision. It's the continuity of a franchise, a cultural institution, a brand. The theories in this ranking, particularly the higher tier ones, are theories about the earlier version of the show more than the current one. The radiation theory's strongest evidence comes from the early seasons, when the plant's violations were depicted with more specificity. The coma theory's triggering event is a Season 4 episode. The Mona Simpson conspiracy is primarily a Season 7 and on story. The collective amnesia theory's key episode is from Season 9. The show that is generating the most compelling theory evidence is roughly the show made between 1989 and 2000. This is not to say that the later show doesn't contain interesting material. It does. And the earlier patterns continue to be visible in it, though with less energy. But the show that the strongest theories are built on is the show at its peak, and the show at its peak was a different cultural object than what the show has become. The theories are, in a sense, a form of critical preservation. They keep the peak seasons alive in a way that is different from simple appreciation. By building elaborate interpretive frameworks around the show's early content, the theories give it a kind of depth that ensures it will continue to be read and reread and discussed and argued about. The theories are what serious readers do with texts that matter to them. They dig in. They insist that the text is worth serious engagement. They refuse to let it be just a cartoon. The Simpsons has survived as long as it has, partly because it became the kind of object that people feel authorized to do this with. It invited the scrutiny. It rewarded the scrutiny. It gave people enough real material, enough genuine pattern and genuine depth, that the scrutiny produced genuine findings. The theories in this ranking are those findings. Some of them are weak, and some of them are strong, and some of them are so well supported by the canonical evidence that calling them theories feels almost like understatement. But all of them are the product of people who took the show seriously enough to look at it very carefully for a very long time. The show has been running for 36 years. The theories have been accumulating for almost as long, and Springfield keeps generating new ones because Springfield keeps being Springfield, strange and yellow and contaminated and impossible and full of people who love each other imperfectly in a town that keeps forgetting to examine itself. The longest-running show in television history is still giving us new ways to look at it. That seems right. That seems like what it was always supposed to do. Extended closing, one last thing before sleep. You've been here for a while now, through every tier, from the bottom to the top, from the theories that barely hold together to the ones that the show has been building since the second season. Through Blinky and the coma and Burns glowing in the dark and Mona kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping and Homer lost 5% of his brain function and laughed because he didn't know why he was laughing. You know Springfield better now than you did when we started. Or maybe you just know it differently. The yellow skin is still yellow. The plant is still there on the skyline. Homer is still driving home through the credits. None of that has changed. What changes, when you spend enough time with the theories, is the quality of your attention when you watch. You hear the things under the jokes. You see the patterns in the physical characteristics of the characters. You notice when someone forgets something they shouldn't be able to forget. And you understand, now, that the forgetting is the show doing something rather than the show failing to do something. You see Burns glowing and you know what the glow means. You see Maggie's eyes tracking across the room and you understand that she sees everything and is choosing, very deliberately, what to do with what she sees. The show rewards this kind of attention. It always has. That's why the theories exist. That's why people who have watched it for decades still find new things in it. Not because the new things were hidden so cleverly that 30 years of scrutiny was required to uncover them, but because the show kept making new things available as the context around it changed. What was satire in 1989 is documentary in 2025. What was a throwaway joke about contamination in Season 2 is the central theory of the show's physical universe in this ranking. What was a season finale cliffhanger in 1995 is still an unsolved mystery 30 years later. Springfield doesn't give up its secrets easily, but it gives them up eventually, to the people who are patient enough to sit with it long enough and ask the right questions at the right moments. You've been asking the right questions tonight, or at least, you've been present while the questions were asked. Let your eyes close. Let the theories settle. Tomorrow, Springfield will still be there, with its cracked cooling towers and its impossible geography, and its town that agreed to forget everything inconvenient, and its family that somehow holds together through everything the world throws at it. The loop will still be floating. The couch will still be there. And Homer will still find his way home. Sleep well. You've earned it.